My story is not about ghosts nor goblins, but something much worse. A man. Yes, a man who forced me to view humans from a totally different perspective. It's a long story, and I've never shared it with anyone, but I have mentioned it to my therapist, as this was a very traumatic experience. Even though this happened to me many years ago, it's important for me to give you as many details as possible, and a bit about myself. My name is Yvonne. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm a female, Asian Hispanic. I know, lovely mix. At the time of this, I was in my 30s. I'm about 5'6" and weighed 130 pounds. Athletic, fair-skinned, and was also newly divorced. I had embraced my newfound freedom. I must warn you though, my experience can be triggering, as it contains many acts of violence, both domestic and sexual assault. So it's really up to you if you wish to proceed. Without further ado, I was going through a party phase, and my way of coping with life was by drinking and partying my life away. Yes, it temporarily numbed my emotions, but due to my selfish behavior, my young children suffered. I was young, but even then, I acted immature. I just wanted to have a good time. I wanted absolutely nothing serious with anyone. My recent divorce was hurting me so deeply, and when I liked someone, I would romance that person until they would be eating from my hand. But then, just like that, I wouldn't contact them again. But when someone showed too much interest in me, I did the very opposite. Yes, I pushed back harder. I had youth and beauty. I was in control, or so I thought. There was this very handsome man who was a friend of a friend's. This night, he happened to be the lucky one who apparently wanted more than to just dance the night away. As you may have guessed, I was most definitely pushing him back, but I had my reasons this time. The last time I had seen this guy, he made comments that made me dislike him even more. "You will be mine," he would jokingly tell me. I would respond flirtatiously yet joking. "Victor, it doesn't hurt to dream." I saw anger in the deep of his big brown eyes, but I promised myself he would get nothing but my pity, and I jokingly said, "I'd rather be dead." Victor replied in a firm voice, "That can be arranged," followed by laughter from him, but also everyone who was there at the party. They thought it was funny too. Then one of Victor's friends said, almost threateningly, "You know, Victor always gets what he wants." With my liquid courage out loud, I said, "I belong to no one, and just to be clear, I'm the one who does the picking and choosing." Feeling slutty, my friends laughed in agreement. Finally, party night had arrived. The plan was for the three couples to all go together, males and females paired respectively. But when I got picked up, to my dismay, guess who I'd been paired with? You guessed it, Victor, who also happened to be the person driving us in his brand new red truck. I knew it was a conspiracy, but I wasn't going to back down. I was ready for the challenge. We decided to go to a very fancy club, and Victor was being a total gentleman from what I could tell. The lights were bright, the music was bumping, and the alcohol was flowing. I felt alive. And tonight was all about me. I realized at one point that I needed to go to the ladies' room. It was there that I assessed my current situation and concluded that I would slow down on the drinking. It wasn't even midnight, and I could already feel the effects, which was odd, because not only was my head spinning, but I would feel terribly sleepy. I also didn't want to drink any more, so I could keep my composure and not do something I would regret. But I was feeling sleepy. There was a point where I almost thought I would fall asleep while standing by the sink washing my hands. At the time, I didn't even realize I hadn't finished up my Jack and Coke. This feeling was new, so now it was a matter of survival. I stormed out of the bathroom to find the girls I came with. I wanted to be near them in case I collapsed, but my steps were getting heavier, as were my eyelids. Then I realized the drink. As I stumbled into the crowd, barely keeping my eyes open, I saw Victor standing there with a grin on his face. He was tall at 6'2", 250 pounds, with brown hair and beautiful dreamy brown eyes. His teeth were perfectly white and straight. He was walking towards me, and as he got closer, I wanted to yell, "You drugged me, you coward!" Then I felt my legs give out, but I don't remember hitting the floor. I really don't know how long I was out. I opened my eyes to the humming of a ceiling fan and the cool air hitting my bare body. The first thought was to quickly sit up and find my clothes, but for the time being I couldn't move. I was able to move my eyes, but my entire body was numb. I began questioning myself. Who did I leave the club with? Where am I? Whose living room was I lying in? I wanted my clothes, but how could I find it if I couldn't even move my hands? Suddenly I heard footsteps and a familiar voice. "You awake?" It was Victor. How could he ask so calmly? I wanted to say many obscenities, but my voice wasn't cooperating. It was gone. I realized I was lying butt naked on my adversary's couch, when I realized he was also naked. No. How could this be happening? I was defenseless, pinned to the couch and unable to scream or run. I was Victor's prey, and he was going to have his way with me while holding me hostage. My own body had betrayed me. I was so thirsty, but I wanted nothing Victor had to offer. Sadly, I didn't have a choice. As he grabbed my hair and sat me up on the couch, he got a styrofoam cup and poured a bitter, clear liquid in my mouth, and at the same time he was holding a knife to the side of my throat and screamed at me to drink. The tip of his pocket knife was so sharp, it was best to cooperate. I was being violated in so many ways. I needed to use the bathroom badly, and somehow it seemed as if he read my mind. He dragged me off the couch and threw me to the floor, and had the balls to kick me twice in the ribs. Then, with a closed fist, punched me in the face several times. I could feel the blood flowing from my nose and into my mouth, and immediately felt a lot heavier. He pointed towards the bathroom, and I began to slowly crawl in his direction. I knew I was probably not going to make it out of there alive, but I couldn't understand why he hated me so much. But what about my children? What would happen to them? There was women's underwear and children's toys scattered all over the wooden floor. I grabbed a moist towel from the floor, noticing that neither my clothes nor purse were in sight. Then I heard a phone vibrating. I quickly located it. There it was, a beautiful flip phone. As soon as I opened it, I dialed 911 immediately. I began digging around the bathroom for any information that I could provide to emergency services. They answered, asking what my emergency was. I let the dispatcher know that it wasn't a prank call, that I had been kidnapped, drugged, raped, and brutally beaten by a man. I gave the address I had found on a prescription bottle label in the medicine cabinet. I was in Gilbert, Arizona. I was trying my best to give the best description of Victor, when quickly he tears down the bathroom door. I'm greeted with a fist across my jaw, causing me to stumble and hit my head at the edge of the sink. My heart sank as the flip phone went flying across the floor. I'm losing consciousness, trying to protest from drinking whatever he's forcing down my throat, but obviously I don't have a choice, because what I hear next just confirmed that I was very much dead. A click. I knew what it was. It was a firearm. I felt the cold barrel of the 9mm that was against my temple. I could feel the warm blood dripping down into my chest from my face. And then Victor said the following. "You called the cops. We have to go now. Besides, I need to get rid of you, because my wife and kids will be home soon." I could barely stay awake, so Victor tried to drag me by the hair. But it was taking too long and he lost his patience. He proceeded to drag me by the arm from the 3rd floor. As he exited the door, he grabbed me, threw me over his shoulder, and was trying to get me in the truck. But somehow I was fighting him. I figured he was going to kill me anyway. I might as well fight this deranged, evil man. I was screaming, biting, kicking, and scratching, but I couldn't see because my eyes were closed shut from injuries. But I imagined he needed the gun to shoot me, then go through my body in the desert. Then I heard the police sirens and people coming out of their apartments to hear the commotion, and I began screaming that he's going to kill me in both English and Spanish. As multiple police cruisers came closer, Victor threw my body into the apartment complex garbage bin and peeled off. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. I needed sutures in many parts of my body. I had a dislocated shoulder, a broken nose, multiple head injuries, many lacerations, and my body was full of bruises. According to the ER doctor, the toxicology report showed 5 different types of drugs, but my alcohol was below the legal limit. You might be wondering what happened to Victor. I saw him when I was able to testify in court. There were 2 other women who came forward with their testimonies and gave Victor an additional 5 years on top of the 8 he got for the crimes he committed against me. Victor whispered a threat when he got sentenced, something that no victim wants to hear. Someday, I'll get out, and I'll hunt you down and finish the job. Listeners, please be cautious, especially if you're going out drinking. Stay with a trusty group of friends, and please keep an eye on your drink and theirs. When in doubt, listen to your gut. This experience changed me. I stopped drinking many years ago and have major trust issues. I cannot emphasize it enough. Always be aware of your surroundings. I had just recently gotten my first job at a chain sandwich shop. It was located in this shopping mall outlet at the far end. There were quite a few businesses around it, including a restaurant down the way and a super Target on the other side of the mall at the far end of the parking lot. My parents were always super protective and taught me at a young age to be aware of my surroundings and protect myself, and rarely ever let me walk alone to begin with. On this particular day, I had left my phone at home because I wasn't allowed to have it at work and had a daily time limit on it anyway. Thanks, Mum. I ended up finishing up early, and my mum was still shopping at the Target, so told me to go ahead and walk over to meet her. I began walking towards the Target and had to wait for passing cars. One silver car stopped and let me walk across. I smiled and waved thank you, and the man inside the car did the same, and turned on the street going in the direction I was walking. I didn't think anything of it, as it was a relatively busy parking lot, and most of the shops are over on the other side by the Target. A minute or 2 goes by and I spot the same car now driving in the opposite direction towards me. I take a mental note, but think that I'm just overreacting. This is until he turns back round. At this point I'm cornered, and notice I'm now at a part of the mall that's a little less crowded with more of an empty parking lot. I get this uneasy feeling in my stomach that he's following me, and to test my hypothesis, I switch my direction. Instead of heading towards the Target, I walk towards the restaurant. The car immediately turns into the parking lot. I switch into freak out mode and speed walk to the front doors. In my time of panic, I didn't realize that the parking spot for the restaurant were completely empty. I pull on the doors and they're locked. They were apparently closed on Sundays. At this point, the man in the grey car was parked in the lot in front of the restaurant watching me. The way he was parked, I would have had to pass his car and go back on the path I was originally on. I stand there a moment, pretending not to notice, and thinking about what to do next. I obviously didn't want to walk any closer to the car than I already was, and decided to cut through the side shrubbery of the restaurant and head towards the closest shop I could find. The grey car comes out of the parking lot still following me, and I bolt into the dollar store across from the restaurant. I see the grey car park, and I walk up to one of the cashiers and explain what happened, and ask if I could use their phone to speak to my mother. She says of course and tells me to stay in here until my mum comes to get me. I call my mum and tell her about the car, and she of course freaks out. By this time I think the man in the car caught on because he eventually backs out and leaves. My mum shows up and thanks the cashier lady, and we drive to Target. Aside from both of us being shaken up, we were fine. It definitely ruined me walking alone again, but now that I'm an adult and live on my own, I carry pepper spray and a pocket knife everywhere I go just in case, and rarely walk anywhere unless I'm with someone or it's only a few minutes away. It still scares me today to think what could have happened, or what that man's intentions were. So to the man in the grey car, let's not meet again. I was walking my dog and crossing the street with a green light, when a guy blows through the red light and almost hits me and my dog. I yell out, "Arse!" and he slams on his brakes and turns around and pulls into the parking lot ahead of me. I get closer and see the car has Illinois plates, while I live in Pennsylvania. He says, "Careful who you call names. I've killed people." I just keep walking, and he drives away. The next day, I hear spree killer Andrew Canaan used stolen credit cards at a gas station in my town. It was 100% him. I've been working armed security for nearly a decade now, but I still remember working unarmed when I started out in my early 20s. I worked my way to a trusted position with my agency, where at 22 years old, I was assigned to the Colorado Springs Deaf and Blind School. At the time, only senior, more experienced officers were permitted to work there at all, but I was given the 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. shifts, Monday night through Saturday morning. A little backstory on the Deaf and Blind School. It was opened in the early 1870s and was where the burdened children of the state were sent to learn and live, but many were put to work there as laborers working fields or manufacturing items. Because of a number of ailments, accidents, or pre-existing health conditions, a large number of children and staff passed while there, to where, in the early 1880s, a small cemetery was created and formed at the intersection of Pikes Peak Avenue and Institute Street. Growing up in Colorado Springs, I was always told ghost stories about the flesh-eating bacteria on stuffed, taxidermied animals, ghosts walking in buildings, and the haunted service tunnels below the school connecting to the old train depot. But I never really believed it. Fast forward to my 3rd month posted there, 2 nights before my 21st birthday, and a full week before students returned for the full semester for our actual special needs schooling. And I had my first encounter in the gym, while checking the boys' locker rooms. A solid black figure ran past the showers. I rushed to find the intruder, not knowing what I would have done to it when I found it, as I was completely unarmed except for a flashlight. After clearing the building twice and checking all the doors multiple times, I took it as my imagination. The night of my birthday is when everything got much weirder. The shift change went as normal, and everything was fine up until 2:30 a.m. Property and building check-ins. When I went into the carriage house top floor, where the school stores all the spare desks and modern school equipment, it appeared that a person was standing in the back corner near the older stairs. I shouted at the figure and began to charge towards him. In a frenzy, I hurried to cut him off at the first floor door, but when I got to the door, it was still locked with the interior bolt. I searched the first floor when I found the doors to the service tunnel opened. On my first day, I was told not to enter into the tunnels alone, as they expanded for miles in a labyrinth. And before I went in, I didn't contact a supervisor. I felt as if I had walked for hours, but only a few minutes, which is when I hear in a very soft voice, almost childlike, "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." The next thing I knew, my very angry supervisor, the school's maintenance director, and 2 CSPD officers were shaking me by the shoulders. My supervisor then informed me I missed my 3 a.m. check-in and was sitting in a corner of the tunnels in the dark for over 3 hours. We all left the tunnels and carriage house to see that the sun was beginning to rise. Later that day, my boss reassigned me to a different location after I was cleared from a doctor to work. I don't fully know what I saw or what was in those buildings, but it still gives me the chills, and I'll never forget the voice that made me black out for so long. "Happy birthday, Mr. Officer." I used to work private security at a shopping mall. My partner and I had already had a feeling this place was haunted, one reason being the homicide that happened right before I was hired, made it so inclined. The very west of the mall made the hair on my neck stand on end the most, and I don't know why. It's also very good to note there is minimal shelter at this end of the mall. You can see the cats and dogs walking through the windows at night, and they would bark and whine a lot. One night, I was walking to that end of the mall, and I started to feel like something was following me or walking behind me. When I got to the shelter, none of the animals were making a noise, but I swear to God, all of them were awake and staring at or behind me. I got really bad goosebumps and a horrible feeling once in my gut. I put my head down and walked out as fast as possible and closed the door. Once outside, all the negative feelings just went away. I was cleaning a bar in the middle of the night. This is an old building over 100 years old, and over 90 when I worked there. The building was a restaurant/bar, and then became a cafe/speakeasy during Prohibition, and there are remnants of tunnels in the basement from bootlegging. As I was cleaning in the middle of the night, and being the only one there, I came around a corner to two men playing pool in the pool room, on the other side of the hallway. I knew they weren't really there, but they were there even after I squeezed my eyes shut. They were both in old Western wear, jeans, hats, one blue, one red plaid. Their movements were fluid, smooth and floaty, almost slow, but not as how they played on the empty table. I wasn't scared, I didn't feel cold or threatened, more curious and disbelief. "Hello, can I help you?" I said as loudly as I could, and started walking quickly towards them, almost at a charge. The one in plaid looked right at me as soon as I crossed the threshold into the room, and they vanished. I have a pretty disturbing story to share. It all starts in December of 1993. I was living in Aurora at the time. It was around 9 p.m, and I had just finished my martial arts class and was waiting outside for my mum to pick me up from the school. My martial arts school was in a smaller shopping center near a well-traveled intersection on the west end of Aurora near Denver. Adjacent to my school in the same parking lot was a Chuck E. Cheese restaurant. It usually closed around the time my class got out, but occasionally some of us would go and play video games or get breadsticks while we waited for class to begin. This particular evening it wasn't terribly cold. It was mid-December, but the winters in Colorado can be somewhat mild. I was still pumped from class, and I was running around the parking lot with another one of the kids from my class. We were distracted, so we did not see the figure enter Chuck E. Cheese. It was the loud popping noise coming from the building that got our attention. Before we could grasp what was happening, a kid came running out of the restaurant with a gun in his hand. He practically ran right into us. The next thing I know, he's pointing it at my face. He just stood there for a minute. It was like time froze. I could not take my eyes off the barrel, and all I could think of was this was probably the last thing I wanted to see in the world. After what seemed like a long time, but was probably a few seconds, I looked past the gun at his face. He wasn't even looking at me, he looked scared. I could see his finger on the trigger and wasn't sure if he was going to pull it or not. I was frozen, and could not have stopped him if he was. Instead, he turned and ran without a word. I watched him go, glued to the ground, amazed that I was still alive. He took off around the side of the building and was gone. My classmate and I just sat on the pavement. Neither of us said anything. Eventually, my mum showed up to give me a ride. I'm sure she was curious why I was acting funny, but I could not bring myself to tell her what happened. As far as I know, she still doesn't know to this day. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I heard people in school talking about what happened. The kid's name was Nathan Dunlap. He murdered 4 people I know personally, in cold blood, and critically wounded another. He had ditched the gun in an attempt to escape. That led to his arrest and eventual conviction. He was to be executed earlier this year for the crime, but was given a stay by the governor of Colorado. Having known that he had killed those people, I believe he would have killed us too. I'm not sure what distracted him that night, but I'm grateful. My family knows I was there that night. I don't think they know the extent of my involvement. I was never questioned about it, and until now, have never really volunteered any information about it at all. But I am now, because some things you learn to let go of. I don't know how much you know about him or what he did, but for a recap, the kids he killed were my age at the time. I didn't find out the extent of what he did until the next day, when I was face to face with him. At that time, I did not know he had just killed 4 people. He looked right at me, but I don't think he saw me. He looked more scared than I was, and I was the one with the gun in their face. I don't know if he should have gotten executed. He claims now that he has found God or whatever in prison, and that he's a different person. Perhaps it's true, perhaps it's not. It will never change the fact he executed 4 children in cold blood over nothing. He is where he belongs, and I'd almost rather see him have him live out the rest of his days reliving what he did, instead of getting the easy way out.
Here in South Africa, we're in lockdown right now. I'm meant to travel for work to Santa Barbara, but since we're under lockdown, I can't go anywhere. I'm an entrepreneur with a tech startup, and since I travel mostly, I make use of the Regis co-working space for a hot desk or meeting room. It's quite flexible, and there's always coffee and pretty girls coming in and out. But since COVID broke out, I saw Regis as a public or corporate office, with many people coming in and out, therefore I was now stuck with no office. A buddy of mine told me he had an entire unused area at his house behind some offices. I would be alone, and I'd have my own kitchen, lounge, TV and bathroom. But the catch is that I'd have to park on the road. Let me explain the way the road is. It's a wide, steepish road with a massive park and zoo on the left, with 3 entrances and parking, and houses and businesses on the right. I use this road quite often to go to Florida Road, a popular bar and food district. There's only street lights on the houses and business side, as there was a red line or no parking line on the other side, left and right, and I had to park outside the park. So I parked in the first parking nearest the building I was working at. It wasn't near, but I still had to walk a few meters. This story takes place one night before the lockdown. I had a call with a company in Denver, Colorado, which I had to start at 6 p.m. South African Standard Time. It went well, and I decided to pack up and leave. I wore formal shoes and carried my laptop in my bag. Being paranoid before I left, I looked on the CCTV before opening the gate and couldn't see anyone outside. I then proceeded to buzz myself out, locked up, and walked out. I don't know how, but in the time it took me to walk from the building to the gate, a man appeared. He seemed drunk or high, and was just hanging around against the fence on the side of the road my car was on, wearing a hooded sweatshirt with the hoodie down, torn brownish jeans and sneakers, and I started walking and looking down, keeping track of him from the corner of my eye. Mine was the only car left, so I would assume he knew that was mine. As I got closer to my car, I noticed him starting to walk out towards me, but I ignored him. He was still walking diagonally, trying to cut me off. He then said, as he was maybe 5 meters away, "Let me help you with your bag." Now, I had a comfortable laptop backpack on, and I was walking hands-free, and yet he asked me to help him with my bag. In South Africa, car guards usually help you with your grocery bags and expect a little tip, but not this guy. This guy knew what I was doing and where I was going, and what I was carrying. To make matters worse, he had his left hand in his hoodie pocket, and was walking fast. It all went down in a split second. He suddenly lunged at me, but being a football player, I feigned left and went right. In that split second I thought, if I ran to my car, which was still another 10 to 15 meters away, I would have surely not made it. I'm fast, but fumbling with keys, opening the door, getting in, I didn't seem confident. So I made the decision of jumping the fence into the now dark park. I made it over in one leap, albeit slightly slower, since my laptop backpack kept bouncing on my back. As soon as I hit the ground, I took my laptop bag off, held it in my hand and ran, and looked for a dark spot to hide. and ended up behind a massive tree in the park. There are a few of them, but it was the only one that didn't have a light directly hitting it. I heard him running and slurring words and saying something like, "Just give me the bag." So my car was on the other side of the tennis courts. If I could get to the tennis courts, sneak around and then run to my car, I would make it. But there was a lit open space between this tree and the tennis court, and he was running straight through the space, and I watched the angle of him running, and slowly rounded the tree to keep myself out of his line of sight. I honestly think him being high helped immensely here, as he ran straight past and towards the other side of the park. When he was a good distance away, which couldn't have been more than 20 meters, I made a break for it. Not being quiet now, I pushed away every branch and leaf which he heard and turned around and saw. I burst around the tennis courts, which was stupid because I could have just came back the way I came, and turned around and saw him yelling and running back at me. He stumbled every now and then, but was picking up the pace and actually gaining on me. I saw it. He had a knife, and it was out now. I puffed my way up the hill, opened the car, jumped in, locked the door with my laptop on my lap and started the car. When I looked back in the darkness, he was gone. He must have slunken back into the park when I was out of range. But where? I didn't wait to find out. I skidded and drove the hell out of there. I won't say that I won't work there again. I would. But maybe I'll Uber next time. The other night, I was driving into the center lane of a 3-lane city street, when all of a sudden a car comes into my right blind spot and almost slams into me. I look over and see it swerving in and out of the lane, braking abruptly. I honk and I look over to see if the driver is possibly distracted, and I see that the man driving is drinking something out of his brown bottle. The man then comes up to my side and is screaming at the top of his lungs. Not wanting to get involved, I then make a lane change to the leftmost lane to get away from the man. I can still hear him screaming, so I turn on my rearview camera and see the man swerving across 2 lanes from the rightmost lane to get behind me. He then starts speeding up, as if he's trying to ram into me from behind. Once I see him inches away from my bumper, I decide to run the red light I am stopped at and make a right turn in front of the 2 lanes of traffic beside me, in the hopes that at this point he'll just leave me alone. I look in my rear view camera and once again I see the man is following me, trying to hit me from behind yet again. I panic and speed off on a side street, but I look back and he won't let up. He's swerving in the lanes behind me and is trying to keep up. In the distance, I see a freeway on-ramp, so I speed over in the hopes of losing him on the freeway. The on-ramp has 2 lanes that merge into one. I pass up a car prior to the merge, thinking that the car will create a buffer between me and the man chasing me. When I look back into my camera, I see that the man is driving in the shoulder, on the brush, to the side of the on-ramp in order to pass the other car and catch me up. At this point I'm driving close to 100 miles an hour and scared for my life. So I slow down and dial 911. I explain the situation to dispatch and she recommends I try to get away to safety. The man then catches me up and begins coming up to my side of the freeway, and he repeatedly tries to swerve into me as if to ram me or run me off the road. I slow down in the hopes that he'll pass me up, but he too slows down, and his wife in the passenger seat throws a bottle at my car. For a second I lose visibility, as the car is covered in a brown foamy liquid. I think to myself, surely this is the extent of his road rage, and I look over and it seems as if he's continuing on the freeway, ready to get away. I then pull off the next freeway exit, thinking I can just leave the situation, and as I do, the man sees me and makes a 4-lane change onto the exit ramp and tries to ram me once again at the freeway exit. I am then forced to speed through the city streets, and I finally end up at a red light, trapped next to the man. I look over at the man and roll down my window, and he's screaming at me. "Why did you honk at me? You're trying to make me look like a bad father in front of my kids? You want to go?" His wife is also yelling at me, asking why would I honk at him in front of his kids. I look into the back seat and see 2 children in car seats. Since I am on speaker with the dispatcher, she hears all of this and tells me I should just try and get away. At this point I'm done. I just want to get away from him, so I make a U-turn to head back onto the freeway. He follows me and almost hits me in a plastic construction lane barrier to do so. He then follows me again and is trying to hit me from behind once I get onto the overpass to get on the freeway. I glance at him, to the side of me, and see that he's holding something up in my direction. Suddenly, I hear a very loud bang, and the dispatcher on the phone screams, "Did he shoot you? Are you okay?" Thinking I've been shot, I start screaming. He's shooting at me. He's shooting at me. He's gonna kill me. Realizing that running away isn't working, I stop at the man's speed off. Luckily, there's no broken glass and I'm not injured in any way. The dispatcher tells me to pull off to a nearby safe location, so I go to the parking lot of a nearby mall, and I tell the dispatcher the make, color, and model of the car as well as the partial license plate. The whole time I drive there, I'm very concerned the man could be following me again, but they send an officer immediately over to file a police report. In waiting for the officer, I realize that my car's cameras are always recording, so I hit the save button and the officer comes over and I tell him the story describing everything in detail. I also tell him that I may have some footage of the whole thing. We take a walk around my car and for the most part there's no damage. The officer then informs me that because I'm not injured and because there is no damage to the car, there really isn't anything that can be done. I ask him if it wasn't an assault, and he says because the bottle hit my car and not me, it's not assault. I ask him if it's reckless driving, and he says here in California that's a misdemeanor, and that requires the presence of a CHP officer to convict. I then ask him if it could be considered an attempt at murder, because he was trying to ram into me, but he says that this is just plain old road rage, and there's not much that can be done. At most, the officer says that once he has the complete license plate, an officer can go out and talk to him. I ask him if the potential footage could help in getting this man reprimanded in some way, and he tells me to only send me the highlights and necessary screenshots, though he doesn't think anything at all can be done. At the end of all of this, I'm extremely shaken up. I eventually go home and review the footage captured by my car. Luckily, I have the entire thing recorded. The moment he almost hit me, his wife throwing a bottle at me, and his face as he's yelling at me, his license plate, and even him trying to ram me, it's all recorded. A few days later, the officer calls me and confirms the license plate I have in the video with a recording he has from the freeway/on and off ramps. A week and a half have passed and there have been no updates. While I understand the law is the law, it is unacceptable to me that this man could be so overtly aggressive on the road, threatening my life and the lives of his children, and the lives of everyone else on the road, with no punishment. I was genuinely scared for my life, and in the process, both he and I endangered others on the road. Ultimately, this has left me feeling very disappointed with the system. An act of violence was committed, and due to technicalities, the driver gets off? I'm trying to keep my retelling as factual as possible, but this was a really terrifying experience. Even in the past few days, I still feel a bit hesitant to be an aggressive driver, like overtaking people or just changing lanes, and have lost my comfort in honking. I really wish I could say this didn't get to me, but it has. One odd detail is that the man was taking pictures of my car before the bang happened. What could he possibly want that for? Has anyone been in a situation like this? Is there truly nothing that can be done? Any recommendations how I can at least have someone check on those kids? Like I said, I have footage and everything.
When I was younger, I had an agency job cleaning buses at the local depot. The pay was abysmal, but it was a chill job where you were left to your own devices most of the time. The fleet was mostly modern, but there were a few ancient double-deckers kept around for less grueling duties. One of those buses in particular was haunted. The other cleaners and I would often hear people walk around on the top deck while cleaning the bottom, and when you were on the top deck, you'd sometimes hear footsteps slowly coming down the stairwell. They would always stop once they hit the top step. Some nights you'd hear the distinctive creaking sound of the destination blind being cranked from the driver's cabin too, but when you ran down, the blind or its handle wouldn't have moved an inch. One night I was on my knees sweeping up broken glass with a dustpan and brush when I noticed something from the corner of my eye. Behind the seat I was sweeping in front of, I could see a pair of legs. They were as solid as any other pair of legs, and I remember that they were wearing, very clearly, green corduroy trousers, dark socks, and brown brogues. They then began to bend. I was crapping myself, and fell back with my eyes firmly closed. Then I dared myself to reopen them. There was nothing there. I finished as quickly as possible, and moved on to the next bus. Over a cup of tea, I told the other cleaners I'd seen something weird on that bus, and she just looked at me and went, "Were they green legs?" I never saw those legs again. But apparently she saw them a few times. Always just the legs. She never dared to look up and just looked away until they disappeared. I used to bartend, and one of my Friday night duties was closing down the restaurant and counting the money, which meant I was often left alone in the building. I would usually turn off half the light and leave enough on so that I could see. On this particular night I did the usual closing stuff and was walking through the kitchen to the office where I would count the money. Right by the office there is a door that leads to the dining area, when out of the corner of my eye I swear I saw an older man sitting in a section of the restaurant that we referred to as the 20s. When I looked, there wasn't anything there. I wasn't scared, but I went about my business. I opened the restaurant the next morning, and the server working with me had worked at the restaurant on and off for a long time. I was talking to her and said, "Yeah, the strangest thing happened last night. No one was in the restaurant, but then I thought I saw someone." And without skipping a beat, she says, "Oh yeah, the man in the 20 section. He likes hanging out there." The fact she knew it was an old man in the section of the restaurant without me giving specifics sent chills like you can't imagine down my spine. An acquaintance of mine was guarding a warehouse on a military base in the middle of an empty field. He told me he always had some candy in his pocket for easy access, in case he saw the ghost of a child. Said kid trespassed and was shot in the 1970s or so, and since then all the night watchmen who heard a kid laugh or cry toss candy at their backs, so they can't see the source of the sound. The story about the ghost boy was in the middle of the last military dictatorship of 1976 to 1981 in Argentina. It was not strange to hear about people disappearing, including 500 kids 15 or younger. That's why lots of people think the kid was not trespassing but escaping the military base, and his ghost is still there to torment the people who kidnapped and tortured him. Another was a police officer working the night shift in the building. A few years ago, a fire destroyed the building, therefore killing the officer working there. He told me it was not a rare occurrence to hear heavy footsteps, as in someone with police footwear going upstairs to him, but he never saw anything. But since both were colleagues, he wasn't worried at all. This next story happened a few streets away from my parents' house almost 10 years ago. It was all over the news, even national news. A bus driver was at the end of his shift and stopped very close to a cemetery. Only him and an acquaintance were on the bus, and the lights were off since it was not taking any more passengers at the time. And both saw a woman in the middle aisle of the bus, young, blonde, and in very bad shape and reeking. She had a bag in her hand and went to the driver to show its contents, and it was a severed human head. The ghost asked the driver to not break eye contact, if this was the end of the route, since she had to ride another bus. Both men saw, listened, and smelt her. Even when she vanished, both were in shock and unable to do anything for a while. Then the driver called his colleague for help, and when they arrived, both the driver and the passenger were in no condition to be left alone. A mechanic had to drive the bus, but had to stop before arriving at the company's garage. The constant ringing of the bell, the one to tell the driver that the next stop is yours, drove him crazy. The GPS stopped working, and the doors opened and closed completely by themselves. It was a very eventful night. This is what happened to me this month. I woke up one morning to a nail in my tire. Great. I looked for the nearest repair shop and made my way there. I was very happy to find a place that wasn't by appointment and was within 5 blocks from my apartment. When I got there, I was greeted by a nice-looking man in a suit. He was shorter than me, had a very short beard and was covered in tattoos. I mean, he had full sleeves and some of his head. He wasn't one of those bad-looking tattooed covered guys though. Anyway, they seemed to work for him. His name was Jake. I told Jake about my plans for my car and my future in the mechanic field. These are all my usual topics for small talk. His eyes lit up, and he said if I ever wanted any hands-on experience, he would be happy to teach me. He wrote his name on a business card and handed it to me. I had worked in a shop previously, but the boss was old, horribly sexist, and outright scary. I had guessed that Jake was in his late 20s to early 30s, and I was so excited because he was young. It's not common to see people that are young that are the boss, and I went home and told my boyfriend all about my experience. I thought about it for a few days, and then called and offered to work Wednesday mornings in the shop. The first Wednesday was uneventful. I watched one of the mechanics work all day and didn't learn anything that I didn't already know. Jake kept checking on me during the day and gave me his personal number so that I could contact him without having to go through the shop landline. The next Wednesday started off like a blast. The first hour I just watched the same tech. Jake came into the shop and asked me if I wanted to run some errands with him. Of course I said yes, because it was hot. I was wearing jeans, and I knew the van could have air conditioning. Jake is the kind of guy that rambles a lot, so we went through topics really fast. We talked a lot about business at first, but then it got really weird. He started talking about the girls he was hooking up with and living with his ex. It didn't really faze me because this is how most of the boys in the industry talk. He bought me food and on our way back home, gave me a $20 bill for coming on his errands. He started leaving subtle comments about my boyfriend and that he should be giving me money, buying me stuff, and that I shouldn't rush into marriage because I was so young. Come Friday, I was extremely bored and didn't want to do my schoolwork, so I texted Jake to see if I could come hang out at the shop, even though I wasn't wearing shop clothes. I was wearing a semi-long skirt and a long crop top. When I got there, he said, "Do you want to make some money today?" I said, "Yeah," and he led me to the back office. It was slow that day, so I was just doing odd jobs around the office and reception desk. He kept saying how much he liked my skirt, which I would like to add showed nothing. Okay, weird. Throughout the day, I kept catching Jake staring down my skirt. Men will be men, I thought. He kept commenting on my outfit, saying things like, "I didn't know you were hiding all that under your shop clothes. Your skirt's gonna make it hard for me to stand up in a minute." At this point, I was just trying to get the job done so that I could make money and go home, and was starting to get really nervous as the comments escalated. "God, it makes me wonder what else you're hiding under there." I responded, "Jake, I have a boyfriend," which he definitely knew. That's when he said, and I quote, "Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to put it in you, but, can I see?" Anger bubbled up in me, and I yelled, "No, you can't speak to me like that." I finished my job to get a whopping $30. Great, all that for nothing. The next morning, Jake called me and told me that his boss came by the shop and got in trouble for having me there, so he told me I shouldn't come back for a while. I was heartbroken and confused. A week went by and I was having trouble sleeping. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Was I really fired for being a liability, or was it because I said no to him? I called Jake on Sunday and asked. He promised me that I wasn't fired because I said no to him, and said that he would have told me if he'd fired me for that reason. Then began ranting and talking about how he went to prison and doesn't play games like that. I told him that what he had said to me made me feel really uncomfortable, and he went on to say that I could still go and hang out whenever I wanted. He was talking about a coffee shop nearby and a restaurant. and was like he was trying to get me to come out with him. After he fired me? Okay, weird. Like, did you not just hear what I said? That night as I was trying to fall asleep, I felt this overwhelming need to check the Megan's Law website. In California, we have a website that shows all registered sex offenders. All that I knew was his name and the town he lived in. I must have read about 300 profiles when a face caught my attention. His face. I shook as I clicked on the profile, which read, Conviction 2008, released 2010. Offense, lewd or lascivious acts with a child under 14. Jake was 20, the child was under 14. Jake was a freaking child molester, but it didn't stop there. I panicked and went down the rabbit hole, finding pages and pages of criminal charges dating all the way back to 2005. He had been arrested a lot of times and done really horrible things. There were reports of stabbing, fights, gang-related offenses, and obviously, child molestation. I can't believe I got in the car with him alone. I worked with him alone. I've talked to him. How did I not know? I'm really glad that I got away from him when I did. I've never been more happy to have been fired in my life. So, with that being said, Jake, let's never meet again.
In December of 2013, during my sophomore year of college, my at the time boyfriend David had a fraternity dinner banquet that I attended with him. It was a nice event requiring everyone to dress up. He was in a suit, I was in a dress and heels. We had a good time, then went back to his place to drop off the award David won and change into tacky Christmas sweaters for a party we had to attend later that night. It was maybe 7:30 p.m., but given that it was December, it was already dark out when we pulled into the parking lot outside of David's apartment. At his place, there was one road with parking on either side. Spots against the building and spots against a fence that lined the edge of the complex property. We parked in a fence spot, with the trunk of our car facing the building, directly across from the stairs leading up to David's floor, maybe 30 feet from safety. David and I got out and went to the truck to get his award when a man started to approach us. David noticed him and said, "What's up, man?" The man said nothing and kept walking towards us. As he got closer, I could see that he was wearing baggy black sweatpants and a camo hoodie. He had the hood on and the drawstrings were pulled tight, so I could only see about half of his face. Both of his hands were in the front hoodie pocket. David said again, "What's up?" And this time the man answered, "Get up against the car." Wait, what? And then the man pulled a gun from his hoodie pocket. I said, "Get up against the car." David got up against the back of the car while the man put the gun against his back. I was in utter shock at what was happening, so I took a step back, now trapped between two cars, a fence, and a man holding a gun to my boyfriend. He told David to give him all the money he had. We both really only used cards and never had cash on us. Unfortunately though, while home for Thanksgiving, his parents had given him $200 in 20s, all of which went into the hands of our mugger. Then he turned to me, pointed the gun at my face, and I'm less than a foot away here, and said, "Your turn." I was dressed up and only carrying a small clutch purse. I literally only had a phone and lip gloss on me. I stammered that I didn't have anything while staring at the gun he had pointed. He then went back to my boyfriend. At this point I could feel my blood starting to boil. I was becoming less frightened and more pissed off, outraged that this man was aggressively stealing from two broke college kids. How dare he treat other people like this? Couldn't he tell that we were coming from an event and he was going to ruin our night? I wanted to kick him with my big clunky heels so badly, but thankfully I realized that would probably just piss him off. I grabbed my phone, keeping my hands in my purse, and tried to dial 911. Unfortunately, my purse was too small to hide any movement, and I was just worried that if he saw me trying to call for help, he'd shoot. So I stood there, staring to the gun pressed into David's back. Finally, he took David's wallet and car keys and threw them in one direction, ran off in the other, and hopping the fence separating the apartment complex from a small neighborhood. David and I stood in silence for a second, trying to grasp what had just happened. We slowly gathered his keys and wallet, and went inside and called the police, definitely in shock. This is where the story gets really interesting. The police had an officer patrolling on the other side of the apartment complex, as it was a group of 26 buildings and we were in 26. The cop was near one, because they had gotten the call the previous day about the same guy mugging someone over there. The police and detectives came over and took our story and asked us questions for about an hour. When they left, it was still relatively early, maybe 9 p.m. And we were very shaken. And David and I decided we'd still go to the tacky Christmas party we had planned on attending, thinking that it might take our minds off this horrible encounter. Our friend was hosting a pre-game at his apartment in Building 3 of the same complex. Even though we decided not to drink that night, we headed over after getting into our tacky sweaters. The pre-game got a little rowdy, and we heard a loud knock on the door, and we opened to see the person who lives next to our friend. He said, "Hey guys, you might want to keep it down. I don't want anyone getting into trouble. I have police and investigators in my apartment right now because I was mugged out here last night. I heard 2 more people got mugged tonight, so please be safe." David and I look at each other and then back at him. "Oh hi, that was us. We're the 2 that got mugged. Nice to meet you, fellow mugging victim." He laughed and shook our hands. The neighbor and David compared knives that they were now carrying as personal defense weapons before he went back to his place. Later on down the road, David and I had broken up, but the security at the complex was amped up. More lights were installed in the parking lot, and my girlfriend and I moved in. We had to park in the same set of spots where I was held at gunpoint. Probably a stupid way to face your fears, but we didn't have any other issues while we lived there. To the man who mugged both me and my friend's neighbor, let's not meet again. This happened last year. My friend and I were coming back to my town after hanging out across the state line, when this lady started flashing her brights to my friend to go faster. We were going the speed limit and it was dark and hard to see. After a while, she pulls to the side of us, which she could have done the whole time, and we can hear her yelling at us like a banshee through our rolled-up windows. In our state, several people have been shot over road rage, so my friend grabs for her phone in case something starts going down. As she's reaching, the car swerves slightly towards the lady and she recovers. The lady screams even louder and gets behind us again, riding our bumper. We come to the first exit for the town I live in, and I told my friend to take it so we could not have this crazy lady next to us. She follows us to the exit, so I have my friend turn into a parking lot. The lady followed us but got caught by a red light, so we leave the parking lot back to the highway, and she comes right back at us again. Luckily, a truck pulled out and blocked her vision of us, and we made a right turn when the traffic allowed on a red light and swerved between cars to put as much distance between us as possible. We finally lost her after she had been following us for 11 miles.
I worked as a security guard at a YMCA as an 18-year-old kid. It was a bit of a joke job as the hostel part of the building was being used as an informal social housing, i.e. runoffs from the prisons or vulnerable people. The police would visit around 3 times a week and take people away who were causing problems, and many were ex-cons or on drugs. The rest of the buildings, i.e. gym, exercise hall, small canteen, was all closed up, and the lights turned out at night. My job was to work 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., checking these buildings every few hours, and also do a walkthrough of the hostel to check that nothing was up. There had been a spat of suicides just before I got there, and in the previous week I had been listening to a distraught brother for an hour on the phone as he begged me to check on his sibling who had threatened to kill himself several times. So anyway, I was on my walkthrough on the bottom floor. All the lights were off. Everything was quiet. To access the bottom floor, I needed to take the elevator down to the basement level. It was an old goods elevator, not for public use. I got down, did my walkthrough, and was on the corridor in sight of the elevator when it pinged and opened, even though I was alone and had not called it. It was covered in blood. When I got to it, there was blood all over the glass mirrors, a little well of blood near the control panel, and blood over the keys. It looked like someone had been murdered. There was no body or tissue, just blood. Suitably freaked out, I jumped in as quickly as I could and pinged up to the reception level. When I got out, I went straight to the desk and informed them what I had seen. The guy there was pretty unwilling to help, but we agreed we should call the police and an ambulance. And as we were discussing this, a different elevator pinged and opened right in front of us, and a guy who looked like a zombie walked out. His face and head was a big welt of blood, and he was on crutches. He looked very confused and fell right in front of us. Basically, this guy was a very high drug addict who tried to take the stairs up to his room in the hostel, fell over and cut his head right open, got concussed, and got onto the wrong elevator, pressed to go up a level, but when he got there, had fallen onto the control panel and sent it back down to the basement where I'd seen it, only after managing somehow to get out at the floor above. He'd been wandering around the place, leaving a trail of blood in his wake, trying to find help. We called an ambulance, and I was severely freaked out. I work in a building that's fairly old, and has had at least 2 people die on the grounds, one violently. All of the staff have seen or heard some very weird stuff. The first ghostly incident I experienced was when I was sitting down waiting for the bartender to finish closing out, so that we could go home. The bar had a bunch of copper Moscow Mule mugs hanging the top of it on nails, which were never actually used. I was just sort of staring into space when I saw a very, very pale and very large hand reach down from the ceiling onto the outside of the bar, reach over and flick one of the cups so it started swinging wildly. The second thing I saw was also in the bar area. We have a little stockroom set behind the bar where the bar staff put their purses, so it's pretty normal to have a member of staff back there looking at their phone. It was late in the evening and there was only me and the bartender, and I was looking for her. I glanced over to the stockroom and really clearly saw the dark shape of a person leaning over the counter, which I assumed was the bartender. I said something to her and then turned around to go somewhere else and promptly ran into her as she was cleaning on the floor. The last things I experienced happened on that same night. I was cleaning the washrooms after we closed, and when I was wiping down the counters, I heard the sound of something heavy slam against the wall behind me, and then slowly slide down. When I turned around, nothing was there, and that was the wall that didn't lie against any other rooms. I was really freaked out, so I finished up cleaning and went back to the bar area, and the bartender asked me to lock the front door. There's a little enclosed alcove that you have to stand in to lock the door, so no one can see you while you're doing it. The second I finished locking, and had turned around from the front door when something slammed right into the door, incredibly hard 3 times, rattling it like crazy. Other employees have seen weirder stuff, but this is the only thing I ever experienced. I worked at Best Buy, stocking shelves a few years ago during the holidays. Only 2 of us in the whole place. No biggie, I'm listening to podcasts and music every night. As I'm stocking the shelves, I see the most clear possible movement from the corner of my eye that's possible. I would have easily staked $1 million, had I had them, that a camera would have just caught someone jogging by. I'm creeped out because the other guy's in the back, and as I turn to check that he is, I catch the movement again on the other side of me. And when I say I sprinted to the back, I mean I moved like Usain Bolt towards a gold medal. We checked videos and of course there was nothing. But that was the night I knew ghosts were real. My name is Yvonne. I'm a female in my 50s. I'm 5'6", a bit on the heavy side, and have limited use of my hands, but hide it well. Presently living in the state of Arizona, and throughout the years have encountered many creepers, and due to my friendly demeanor, I seem to attract them like a magnet. I can make small talk with just about anyone. I show no fear, and I walk with confidence. For these same reasons, I'm not afraid to tell anyone phrases such as, "Please back away, you're making me uncomfortable," and "I'm not interested." You've been warned. But my favorite phrase is, "Don't come any closer because I'm armed." I could say that I have trained myself for any kind of encounter. Every month I drive across town to visit my clinic doctor, as I must receive a much-needed medication, and my last visit was scheduled for mid-morning, which is when the clinic's lobby is at full capacity. I arrived and parked in the front of the clinic, which is a one-level building with two main entrances facing east. I make it a habit to always do a quick scan of my surroundings before I exit my car. I like to check for any immediate danger before I put myself in a vulnerable position. On my keychain, I carry a whistle, a small knife, a screwdriver, pepper spray, and my panic button, all in miniature size. I'm old and frail, but I'm not going down without a fight. No, I'm not an aggressive person. You might think I'm overly prepared, and maybe I am, but if you've noticed, it's a violent world we live in, and people like me are targets just about anywhere. I noticed that at one of the clinic entrances there was a man of about 6'4", maybe 300 pounds, with a long, unkempt beard and tobacco-stained moustache. He appeared homeless, and I have nothing against the homeless, we're all human after all, but I figured if he's standing by one entrance, I would enter through the other, to avoid him, at least being 12 feet away from him. I began walking towards the door, and this man started to approach me halfway towards the entrance. He then stretched out his hand and said in a southern accent, "Name's Jake, little lady." I didn't shake his hand, but did say hello. He went on to say that he'd seen me before but forgot my name. As he said this, he tried to block my path. I replied, telling him I'd never seen him before, but it was nice to meet him, and if he could excuse me, because I was late for my appointment. He then quickly added if I could take him down the street to Circle K. It wasn't a request, it was a command. "I don't think so, Jake," I replied. As I began walking away, I heard him grumble in colorful words. He was talking about how I could just walk away from him. "She thinks she can just make fun of Jake and walk away." Yes, he was in fact referring to himself in the third person. I pretended not to hear him, but I knew not to let my guard down because this man was on a mission, and that had me shaking inside. The clinic's lobby was packed, and for a moment I felt safe. I signed in and made my way to sit next to an exit door, still on high alert. Then everything happened so quickly. I pulled out my Samsung Galaxy earbuds and set up Spotify to listen to my favorite podcast, and put the volume on low. I saw Jake approach me, and I felt my heart skip a beat, but I remained cool and collected. "Give me your earbuds." I turned off my podcast, put my earbuds away, and slowly stood up. At this point, his voice was louder. "I said give me your earbuds." "I don't think so." He then took a step closer, and by now he was aware that I was armed and was going to defend myself. I gave this man a last warning, and to both our misfortune he didn't comply. Jake takes 2 big steps and then sprints towards me as if he was a football player and he was going to tackle me. I screamed and prepared for impact. I knew I was no match for this man. I managed to pepper spray him all over the face, causing him to go down. As he was falling, he attempted to drag me to the ground with him, as he's screaming in pain. He begins pulling me away, and as I'm looking for the exit I sat next to, I noticed 2 people coming in and seeing the action. They froze in place, blocking my exit, and they got pepper spray residue. All the people just stood and videotaped the incident. The staff alerted security and contacted the authorities. I wasn't going to be taken down by this monster, so I basically put all 170 pounds on his back. As I was screaming like a maniac, security finally came and handcuffed Jake. Fortunately, I wasn't hurt, but I was rattled and couldn't stop shaking. Afterwards, I went to the bathroom and cried like a child. My heart goes out to people who are not mentally stable either by choice or by lack of resources. To Jake, if you're listening, You must have thought that I wasn't scared of you, but honestly you terrified me, and I've had nightmares of you since we met. I don't plan on using the rest of my miniature weapons, but I wouldn't think twice to defend myself. So, Jake, for your own sake, let's not meet.
I'm a 20-year-old female. This story happened when I was about 15 and lived in the backside of a relatively nice suburban neighborhood. My street ended in a cul-de-sac, and my house was one of the 4 or 5 in the circle. When I was little, there was nothing behind the cul-de-sac other than a field with woods. But as I got older, they continued to build onto the neighborhood. And when I was around 14, they started building in the field behind my home. At the time, it was just a small ladder-shaped road with maybe 1 or 2 houses being built towards the back. I had a friend I would walk or ride my bike to see that lived on the other side of the neighborhood. I would usually walk down my road and through the neighborhood to get to the other side to her house, but this newly built road cut straight across the back and cut the trip to her house almost in half. So on this specific day, I chose to walk with my little puppy to her house on this new back road. The road was in construction, so no one was ever really back there, secluded in the backside of the neighborhood, lined by thick Kentucky forest. I had one headphone in through my iPod Classic and was jamming out, kind of skip walk / dancing, all ignorant teenagers happy to see my friends, stupidly not paying attention to my surroundings. That's when I noticed that most of the construction crew and trucks were already gone and saw 2 men talking to each other by one of the houses. I couldn't tell if they were looking at me or not, and I got a strange vibe from the guys, so I kept an eye on them and clicked my iPod off, pulling my dog a bit closer, and just kept walking. They quickly rushed to a truck parked on the road parallel to me and turned it on. They sat there for a few seconds idle, and then pulled off relatively slow once I had passed them on my respective street. They went down and turned around on the connecting road and started to pull up slowly behind me. My "this is weird" alarm started going off, and I pick up my pace a bit. They did the same. We both slowly increased our pace until I leaned down, scooped up my dog and started running at full speed, my heart pounding in my ears. Their truck's front bumper was basically at my heels, running faster than I ever thought I could. The truck still increasing in speed. I cut a hard right off the road and down the steep hill into a small strip of forest between this new road and the backside of a few other houses down the hill a bit. As I slid on dirt and rocks at full speed, clutching my dog to my side, I heard the truck slam on the brakes right above me. I slid into this thin bush and laid flat. My dog made a whimpering sound trying to squirm out of my arms, and I covered his mouth and nose with my hand and held my breath. The 2 men had gotten out of the truck maybe 10 feet away from me at the top of this little steep drop-off. I remember staring at the sky through the bush, flat on my back, dead still as they started to come towards me, searching for me. "Where'd she go?" the one man said to the other. "Shh, shut up." The other muttered back, "Hey." He called, drawn out almost like how someone would say, come out," while playing hide and seek. I was frozen in this bush in total fear, as the men leaned over the bush and somehow didn't look straight down. "Honey," he called again, and I stared straight up at his nostrils, the evening sun casting a dark shadow over his eyes, the bill of his baseball hat. "Hell, I don't know," he says, frustrated and quiet, and started to turn around. "Let's get out of here," the other said, already running back up the hill to the truck. I laid there until the truck pulled away with the puppy clutched to my chest, and I ran back down the hill and all the way home. I ran in the door and slammed it behind me, basically throwing my dog down and turning around to peep out the glass to make sure I wasn't followed. I told my parents, but they said to not take the road to my friend's house anymore. I wish they'd done more. But it was in the past now, right? I hope those guys never hurt anyone or tried to chase anyone else with their truck. So weird guys in the truck from my old neighborhood. let's not meet again. Let me preface this by saying that while I was pregnant, a colleague of mine with whom I was close had started coming with me any time I left the office to do anything. Pick up records, shop during lunch, grab something to eat, because she was adamant that a young, heavily pregnant girl shouldn't be out by herself. Too many horror stories about pregnant women being taken or cut open for their babies and stuff. She would say that, and no matter where we went, she would always have an absolutely true story about someone she knew personally who had been stalked or threatened or nearly abducted while pregnant. At the time, I brushed off her warnings as utter nonsense. Skip forward a few months. I was 23 and a new mother confined at home on maternity leave, and very excited for my first daytime excursion out the house with my infant son, who was 2 to 3 months old at the time. My husband wasn't too thrilled at the prospect of me going out alone with our son while he was at work, especially in my pre-mum car, a white Mustang GT convertible, but he begrudgingly accepted on the condition that I swap cars with him for the day, since he drove the Ford Explorer we had purchased in anticipation of the baby's arrival. I'd only driven the truck once since we bought it, so I wasn't that familiar with it. Nonetheless, I loaded it up with the stroller, the car seat, a diaper bag overflowing with nearly all of our baby gear, and a 6-month emergency supply of formula. You know, just in case. I was only running out to do errands and planned to stop at Target, the grocery store, and pick up a few things for lunch on the way home. My first stop was Target, where I relished my newfound freedom, not paying nearly as much attention to my surroundings as I should have been. But on my way out, one thing did catch my eye. An average-looking white guy in his late 20s to early 30s, average height, with dark blonde hair, wearing a tight, light grey t-shirt and nerdy glasses, leaning against the wall leading to the store exit. I immediately felt a wave of terror wash over me, but I convinced myself there was absolutely nothing abnormal about him to warrant my worry, and I brushed it off as new mum paranoia. Next, I made my way to the grocery store, where I parked towards the back of the parking lot to avoid smashing into any other cars, since I had no practice parking such a big truck. As I hopped out the driver's seat, another completely normal thing grabbed my attention. A compact red Chevy parked 2 lanes over from me, with a good 12 to 15 spaces between it and the car parked next to it. I had parked far back for a reason. I remember thinking the Chevy had no similar discernible reason, but again, I'm a paranoid mum with an already paranoid nature, so I ignored it. I did make note, however, that I thought the Chevy had parked there before me. I would later realize it had followed me there, but the driver still hadn't gotten out, even though I had pulled in after it and spent a good 10 minutes getting the baby into the stroller before going in. You would think the driver would have gone into the store by now. Over an hour later, I returned to the truck and scanned the parking lot. There was the red Chevy still parked in the same spot, driver still in his seat. Again, I rationalized that he must have gone in after me and somehow had people finishing just before me. Otherwise, he'd had to have been watching me. And rational people don't think other people are watching them, right? I packed everything up and headed across the street to the McDonald's drive-thru to pick up something to eat on my way home. The Chevy was following me, I noted, but while I pulled up to the speaker, he pulled into the back of the parking lot of an adjacent bar and parked facing me. Logic would normally overcome at this point, but I was determined not to be crazy, so I collected my food and decided to prove once and for all that the Chevy wasn't following me. I left the drive-thru and headed back to the grocery store, where I had first noticed the Chevy since he was still there. I thought he would have no reason to go back unless he was stalking me, and sure enough he followed. Now hell-bent on proving myself wrong, I looped around the parking lot, crossed into the neighboring street, and back through the parking lot again. Something no one would have any reason to do unless you're trying to prove that you're being followed. Of course, to see if he followed. I had to repeat the loop 3 times before I was thoroughly convinced that I was being stalked. I finally allowed the fight or flight feeling I had been fending off all morning to take over. I suddenly thought of my colleague who had repeatedly told me to never drive straight home if I ever thought I was being followed. Knowing that I lived in a very remote area with no neighbors, I started to head for the police station. The only problem was, I hadn't thought to check the gas gauge, and since my idiot husband never stops for gas, the low gas warning chose to go off at that very moment. I knew I didn't have enough gas to make it to the police station, let alone home, and the Chevy had to know I was onto him by now, so I wasn't about to risk stopping to fill up. I started coming up with alternatives. I could call 911 from my cell phone, explain the situation, and have a police officer meet me in the middle before I ran out of gas. Brilliant, I thought to myself. And as I reached across the passenger seat to grab my cell phone. Unfortunately, as I was unfamiliar with the truck, I didn't know that you weren't supposed to lay anything on the passenger seat. One sharp turn, and whatever was on it would slip across the seat and down into the space between the side of the seat and the door. I frantically patted down the entire seat before I realized my phone must have slipped, and there was no way I could reach it without pulling over and getting out. By now I was going 80 miles an hour down the highway, and the Chevy was right behind me. I peeked out the rearview mirror, and he was close enough for me to make out what he was wearing, a light grey t-shirt, and I recognized the nerdy glasses covering his determined eyes. I realized it was the totally normal guy I had seen standing at the exit of Target. He'd been following me for almost 3 hours by now. I suddenly understood the gravity of the situation. I wasn't crazy, I was being hunted. The last idea I could conjure up was to make a break for my husband's uncle and aunt's house. They lived in the neighborhood just next to the grocery store, and his uncle worked the swing shift, which meant he would be home right now. If I stayed in the trunk and honked the horn, I could get him to come out and see what was going on. He's a badass kind of guy, definitely the kind you wouldn't want to annoy, and I knew he'd protect me and the baby. The only problem was, I was going in the wrong direction down the highway, and I'd have to take a jug handle and wait at the light to turn myself around. And by now I was sure that even a red light would be more than enough for this guy to bust open my window and end my life and steal my son. Then I recalled another bit of advice from my colleague. If you ever need help but you can't call for it, break the law and you'll get the police's attention. I decided my best course of action was to make an illegal U-turn at the next possible traffic light, and if the Chevy followed me, book it to my uncle's house. If my blatant traffic violation caused the attention of a nearby police officer, I could appeal for them for help, and his mere presence would likely scare the Chevy away. I passed 3 lights waiting to find a patrol car until I saw an opportunity. A very short gap in a barrage of lunch traffic spanning 4 lanes. Maybe, just maybe, I could pull off this U-turn and the Chevy would get stuck waiting for the traffic to pass before he could follow. I stayed in the left lane, and I approached the light praying it would stay green long enough for me to make it, and tanked every pound of what little weight I had on the gas pedal. Right before I approached the light, it turned yellow, so I quickly turned the truck left and rammed it, crossing my fingers I didn't cause an accident. The tires squealed so loud I was sure I was going to flip the truck, but I kept going, ignoring the noxious smell of burning rubber, frantically checking behind me to see if it had made it. He was stuck at the red light, blocked by traffic, still facing in the opposite direction, pounding into his steering wheel. I drove around back roads near the highway for what seemed like an eternity, until the gas ran to E before I finally had the courage to stop. At the gas station, I got out to get my cell phone while the attendant pumped my gas, trying to conceal my violent trembling. I was too afraid to sit for long, so I waited until I was back on the road to call the police. By now I knew the Chevy had gone, but the dispatcher still sent an officer to meet me on the highway and lead me back to the station, just in case he was still looking for me. I was too consumed with escaping to catch its license plate, and I didn't know the color, make, nor model of the car, and I had gotten a pretty good look at the driver in Target. The police were able to get a photo of the driver and the car from the surveillance videos at Target and McDonald's, and I was pretty confident they'd find him. Unfortunately, by the time we had moved out of state, a year later, they still had no clear idea who the guy even was. The fact that he was unsuccessful in his pursuit probably bumped the priority of my case to the bottom of the pile. although the police department did spend quite some time investigating, fearing that he had succeeded before, or worse, that he might strike again. I'll probably never know what the guy's intentions truly were. The police, family, and friends have theorized everything from a stupid prank spawned from road rage to an easy rape to kidnapping my son. But I still shudder to think what would have happened had he caught me. And even now, 4 years and 5,000 miles away from the town where it happened, I still check the parking lot of every establishment I visit, just in case he found me and has come to finish what he started. If anything good did come from this, though, is that I learnt my lesson. No matter how crazy and paranoid my husband thinks I may be, I will always trust my gut when I feel like something's wrong. Oh, and now I always make sure to fill up the gas tank whenever it drops to half a tank, so I never have to worry about stopping for gas if I'm ever in a sticky situation again.
I'm a 27-year-old male who lives in eastern Kentucky. I work as the head of security for a chemical company. I signed an NDA, so I can't reveal what the company's name is, but I can say that it's a productions plant and warehouse in the middle of nowhere. And when I say middle of nowhere, I mean at least 10 miles from the nearest town. I always thought it was kind of weird to have security guards at a factory so far from town, but I digress. I usually work with another security guard who was hired within the last year. He's one of those guys who takes his job too seriously. I had been at this position for about 5 years, and most of my 12-hour shifts consisted of checking video feed, patrolling grounds, sometimes redirecting delivery trucks to the nearest rest stop as we didn't take deliveries at night, and generally slacking off and browsing 4chan and Kiwi farms on company time. The way the factory is laid out is there is a small wing for offices in the front, with the employee parking right next to it. Behind that is a break room, which leads out to the production floor, which leads to the 2 warehouses. One for standard safe chemicals, the other is for flammable chemicals, and outside in the back are 4 very large silos, which are used to store sort of material. The whole facility, of course, is fenced, with barbed wire for added measure. One night in December of 2020, I was doing my usual routine of slacking off. I was sitting in my office browsing Kiwi farms and enjoying some dipping tobacco when my company-issued radio went off. "Hey Alex, you got anything on the cameras up there? I heard some movement out here in the warehouse." It was the other guard. I looked over towards my monitors and switched to the warehouse camera. I didn't see anything except for the other guard walking around, shining his flashlight. "Nah man, I don't see anything. You're probably just hearing stuff. Probably one of the ventilation units kicking on." "Yeah, you're probably right. I don't see anything anyway." I turned my attention away from the monitors and went back to wasting my time, as I still had 6 hours left on my shift. I began to get bored, so I reached into my backpack to pull out a can of computer duster and got ready to take a fat rip. Right before I could, I heard the motion sensor alarm go off, signifying that there was a truck trying to pull into our receiving dock. I got on the radio and asked the other guard to go up to the gate and send the trucker on his way to the rest stop until morning. "Roger." I go up to take a dump in the front restroom. Taking only my flashlight with me, I walked out of the office and started down the stairs, and started to make my way across the production floor, opening and closing the overhead metal doors to prevent fires from spreading as I went. I shut the last overhead door behind me, and was passing the area where all of the forklifts were parked and charging, when my radio cracked on. There isn't a truck out here. You sure the sensor went off?" I started to get annoyed, thinking he was messing with me. "Yes, it definitely went off. I'm going to use the restroom, so my radio's going to be off for a few minutes. Go ahead and make your rounds in the offices and parking lot, and then walk the fence perimeter and check the silos." I then shut my radio off. I got into the restroom, and while I was doing my business, I heard a loud metallic clang, like something large hitting the floor. I wasn't sure what it could have been, but it startled the hell out of me. I finished up and started back towards my office, turned my radio back on, and asked the other guard, "Did you hear a clang by any chance?" "Nah, I'm out walking the perimeter right now. Care if I go on break when I'm done?" "Go ahead," I say. I was going to go ahead and make my rounds anyway. "I'll be in the warehouses if you need me." "Roger." I walk back up to the office to grab my phone and a clipboard, with an incident report sheet in case anything had actually fallen. I put an earphone in and start listening to some black metal and hear some thunder roar outside. I thought to myself, well, maybe that's the noise I heard. I open the overhead door to the front warehouse and walk inside, then close it behind me. The higher-ups always make a big deal about us just leaving them open, and I always thought it was a waste of time. I'm absent-mindedly walking down the corridors of the warehouse, thinking about how badly I need a smoke. I was in the non-flammable warehouse, so figured I could get away with it, as long as the other guard wasn't in the office and checking the camera feed. So I lit up the cigarette and sat down on top of an empty metal drum. I took my earphones out and thought I could hear footsteps. I brushed it off as myself being overworked and too tired for my own good. I finished my cigarette and continued my rounds. Now keep in mind, this is a chemical productions plant, so there are all kinds of chemicals that have very distinct but not pleasant smells in this place, especially in the warehouse. But I caught a whiff that seemed to be out of place. It kind of smelled like sulfur. We don't work with anything that has sulfur in it, as far as I know anyway, and once again I brushed it off and kept walking. My earphone battery was dead, so I took it out and put it back in my pocket. I had finished my rounds in the front warehouse and was about to start in the back one, when after a few minutes I made my way out to the silos to make sure the top hatches were still closed and sealed, when my radio went off again. Just the beep you hear before the other person talks. I was waiting to hear the other guard say something, but he didn't. I called back, "Everything good?" but got no reply. I turned it off and back on, hoping that would fix the issue, but still no dice. When I turned it back on, it began making static noises and wouldn't stop until I turned it off. Only when I took the batteries out did it stop, and I once again brushed it off. I made my rounds in the back of the warehouse, uneventfully, and made my way out across the silos. It was pouring with rain at this point, so I wanted to get done and back inside as soon as I could. The worst part is that the silos are over 50 feet tall. Luckily, the tops are all connected by a metal catwalk. I climbed up the staircase as quickly as I could, made my check, and started heading down. While I was walking down, my radio started to crackle again. I thought it was weird, since I'd already taken the batteries out. I get back inside and start making my way back to the office, when I hear footsteps. It sounds like someone's running towards me. I point my flashlight in that direction and see the other guard running away. He's as white as a piece of paper, so I tell him to slow down. "The hell are you doing, man? Someone's in here, dude. I tried reaching you on the radio, but I couldn't get a hold of you." I didn't believe him, but still I was his boss and still had to hear him out. "All right, let's go back to the office. You can tell me what happened, and if we have to call the sheriff's department, then we will." He seemed to take comfort in my words, even though I was really just trying to be polite to calm him down. We sat in my office, and he relayed his story. "When I was walking back from break, I heard someone call my name from outside the fence. I was confused, so I turned around to see who was calling for me, but no one was there. So I kept walking. I got to the office door and tried to put in the passcode, but it was unresponsive, so I used the manual key to get in. After I went to close the door, I felt something stop it from closing. Like if someone put their foot in front of the door. I heard someone call my name again, but no one was there. Then the door slammed shut by itself. By then I figured maybe someone from day shift came in to mess with us, but there are no cars." He got cut off mid-sentence by the receiving doorbell ringing. It had to be rang manually, and is only there so the shipping and receiving guys know when a trucker needs to be let in. It only rings for as long as the button is held down, and it rang close to a whole minute.
I switched the camera feed to outside cameras and saw nothing on any monitors, and we have cameras at every door. "Screw this," I hear, and I turn around to see the other guards stand up and walk out. "I'm out here. I quit. I didn't sign up for this." I was starting to get spooked myself because I'd never seen anything like this happen before. I didn't bother trying to stop him from leaving. I just told him I'd make sure the gate was open. Haven't seen him since. I figure maybe if I cut the power and turn it back on, the issues will stop coming up. I walk to the plant manager's office and dig around for his extra set of keys. I found them in one of his drawers and head towards the room with all the fuse boxes and breakers in it. I walked into the small room with all of the breakers and fuse boxes and started looking for anything that could have been the master power switch. After looking for a few minutes, I noticed it had gotten considerably colder. It was normally pretty toasty inside the building, but it almost felt like I was standing outside again. I started to really wonder what was going on, and just started flipping switches. After hitting one, everything was cut off. The doorbell started going again though, and I hadn't even switched the power back on. The very second before I flipped the switch to turn the power back on, I heard a loud crash. It wasn't coming from inside the building, but that's all I could tell. I flipped the switch and nothing happened. This is where it gets anticlimactic. I started to panic, ran back into my office, locked the doors and figured I'd wait there until the plant manager sent me home in the morning. I sat there for 3 hours and nothing happened. The manager showed up, asked me what happened, and I told him the storm must have knocked the power out, and that I had caught the other guard sleeping on duty and he quit when I tried to write him up. Sorry for the anticlimactic ending, but that's all I can disclose. I wonder if the cameras managed to catch anything. If I still worked at that plant, I tried to see what I could find. Before my dad became a state police officer, he did some security work at a big factory. He's not normally a superstitious person, but when he told me this with such a weird seriousness to it, it kind of scared me. He's always said, "I don't mess with that stuff," regarding supernatural things. His story was in the early 80s. With working at the factory, he always had the night shift. It was just him, and the factory was big. He had his own little room where he could sit and watch TV, or the radio, relax, or do whatever. Well, the rest of the factory, for the most part besides the exits, were dark, and his job was actually to put the petrol in the factory every hour. He'd grab up his flashlight and just stroll around the place, going down row by row, peeking his head out left and right. One night he set to do his usual run with a flashlight in hand, but he couldn't see that something was unusual to his eye. And when he walked out of the dark, you know the sensation you get when your eyes adjust to the room and you can just make out certain things better? There was something darker in the main hall now, and it was moving. He paused for a minute, and as his eyes fully adjusted, there seemed to be nothing. He took a second swipe with the factory and his light, and then decided that the thing was not worth seeing. He went down to the main row and started his run. Everything was normal, nothing out of the ordinary, although he was a bit on edge, seeing as the factory without big movements and shadows was creepy enough. When the rows of the factory ended, there was a big open area at this end. There was the entrance of a factory. Normally, there would be a dim light at the front, but tonight it had dimmed lower. He thought it was weird and really began to sweat. So instead of investigating any further, he turned from the exit and went back to the main row and got back up to his room. That's when out of the corner of his eye, he saw what he could only describe as a black, cloaked figure. His light hit it and he saw it, tall and distinctly human-like, but nonetheless a figure. He just went right back to his own room. He left the factory and called the owner to tell him he wouldn't be returning, and I don't blame him. I worked as a janitor for a company. We had a contract to clean all the buildings this reality company owned, so they wanted this old-ass building carpet cleaned. It was in a decent area and old-school part of town. Well, I pulled up and unloaded all my stuff from the van into the doorway.
As soon as I got there, I had a really bad feeling, almost like bubble guts. Well, none of the lights are on except the light that they have to keep the place dim, like little lamps and stuff. So I'm walking to the back and turn on all the lights, and the switches are right across from the bathrooms. As soon as I turn the lights on, I turn around to see the woman's bathroom door is cracked, and then it slams shut. I froze for a good 5 minutes, trying not to crap myself, and debated on opening the door to see what was up. Till this day, I still don't know what it was. I just packed up my stuff and got out of there. They never asked about it either, because obviously it didn't get cleaned. This happened around 2002. I moved to Belfast from London, and I would have been about 11. I'm 30 now. I lived in a new area. A lot of houses were being built, and they were all massive and beautiful houses despite being a terrible area, which I thankfully no longer live in. I'm with a friend called Dave. We're looking for my sister, and we go around the corner from my house, where they are building a bunch of houses, and it's pretty dark. I'd probably say it's like 10 or 11 p.m. I don't really remember why we were actually looking for my sister. I don't even think she was around. We were walking past houses that looked pretty much finished. We're chatting and a guy randomly shows up out of the blue behind us, grabs a hold of me. Dave, by this stage, is batshit petrified and runs away crying and climbs over a fence. He completely ditches me. The guy is very casual despite being creepy, and I'm not as freaked out as I should be. I assume he's a provie, which is someone who watches the streets in West Belfast. He's got a hold of me, and it's like when you've been caught in a place you shouldn't be in. I expect him to just be like, "You shouldn't be here at night while we're patrolling the streets." But suddenly we go to a house which isn't completely built yet, and nobody lives in it. I'm standing outside this basement-looking house while he's outside phoning the cops. I assume he's fake calling them. The conversation sounds fake, like he's just trying to scare me. And this is where I really get freaked out now. Because on the upstairs, there's this constant tapping sound. It can't be a builder because it's 11 p.m. It sounds like someone is locked inside something and trying to get out. That scared me. It was the speed of the sound, and as if they knew I was in the house. It sounded like they were trapped upstairs or something. Suddenly he's off the phone and he's like, "Okay, the cops are coming to your house soon. Leave now." And I'm thinking, nah, not really. I didn't give you my address. But at the same time I was freaking out because maybe this guy knows the streets and where I live. So that entire night, I was just looking out my window hoping no cops would come by, and they didn't in the end. And he obviously did all that just to scare me. But why? This situation for me is frightening, because a random guy grabbing a hold of you in the street in the pitch darkness is freaky, regardless or not whether it's a building site, despite the fact I probably shouldn't have been there. He could have put me in a room and locked the door, had someone torture me or something. I've always wondered, why he was there, what he was doing. Afterwards, I was scared to go out at night in the area, unless I had someone accompany me. Truth be told, there were a lot of issues in the area, and I'm guessing that guy was like a bunch of other guys that were just acting like undercover police, since they aren't usually comfortable coming to where I live, since they'd usually get bricked. It comes from the Troubles. Looking back though, I think the entrance was blocked off, and we weren't actually allowed there. Considering the situation, I was actually pretty calm compared to my friend, and I have terrible anxiety. I think I just assumed this guy wasn't bad, but again, on any given day, he could have been bad. Really.
This happened when I was about 5 or 6, with my older brother who was around 10. Our family went camping a lot, with another family who had a son around my brother's age. My dad was in the Navy, so my brother and I were used to walking around base to our friends' houses, or to a nearby park, as it was pretty safe. So we had no problems going place to place without our parents. I guess that's why our mum let us ride our bikes down to the park at the campground we were staying at. We had been begging to go, and the park wasn't too far from the spot we were staying at. Of course, at the time I was obsessed with animals, and my only goal in life was to one day work with Steve Irwin, so I brought my dog along. He was fully grown but not very intimidating and definitely not aggressive. He was a border collie, blue heeler, black lab, Australian shepherd mix that I loved more than anything. My brother and I play until our hearts are content, or as much as we can while still holding onto the dog's leash. We stop so my brother can use the bathroom, and I wait by the wall outside with my dog. I'm standing there just petting him, and this huge guy walks out. I still remember that he was wearing a black jacket and a grey shirt and jeans, and he had a big beer belly and grey hair. My dog, who had never even looked at someone funny before, picked up his ears and stared at the guy, hair standing up in attack position. The guy stopped right in front of me, and I felt my whole body go numb and my blood turn cold. I went rigid and pushed back into the wall as far as I could. The man stared into my eyes and stepped closer. My dog was practically rabid at this point, tail up, foaming at the mouth, hair standing up like a cartoon cat, and growling and snarling like nothing I'd ever heard before. The man looked at me for a while, then to my dog. I still remember his eyes, brown, but something glossed over. They almost sparkled. My dog stepped towards him and he backed away, eventually turning and carrying on. My brother came out after the guy was gone, and I told him there was a stranger or something, and he told me the guy had been staring at him too when he was drying his hands. We decided to go back to the camper after that, and we never told our parents because we probably thought we'd get in trouble. Stupid, I know, but I was 5. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if my dog hadn't have been there. He, unfortunately, passed a little over a year ago, and that was the only time he'd ever shown aggression like that in his life. They say animals know, and I believe that completely. I also think now that that guy may have been waiting in the bathroom for kids to show up, and didn't do anything to my brother because he didn't know if there were any adults outside. Then when he saw I was the only person there, he tried to make a move. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but I'm glad that we didn't meet again. My name is Gary, and this happened to me in my senior year of high school. I live in West Tennessee, and we usually get 2 or 3 snow days a year. The area isn't used to much snow, so normally a small amount could get us out for the day. This particular day should have been a snow day, but for whatever reason the school decides the roads were safe enough to drive on, even though some patches of the road had ice on them. We were all annoyed but went to school anyway. Then after school got out, I went to my friend John's house and we hung out and played video games till it got dark, and I decided to drive home. Mind you, the roads had gotten a little better, but some ice was still there. It's about a 15-minute drive from John's house to mine, but I was trying to be extra careful not to hit any ice, so it was going to take a little longer than usual. Pulling out of John's neighborhood, there's a blind hill behind you that always stresses me out, because if someone came through there fast, they could rear-end me. The road isn't very busy, so it's never been a big deal, but this time a car comes over the hill right as I pull out, and they had to slam on the brakes because I pulled out in front of them. In my defense, they were going way too fast, but I still felt bad about it. They laid on the horn and were clearly angry at me, and I gave a small apology wave and went on my way with them still behind me. 10 minutes later, they're still behind me and tailgating me with their brights on, making it harder for me to see. I was getting nervous because they were clearly very angry, and I realized by this point that they were following me. I didn't know what to do, and definitely didn't want to lead them to my house, so I started taking random turns trying to lose them, but they were right on me the whole time. Eventually I started driving faster, so that maybe I could get enough distance between us so that I could make a turn they wouldn't see. But that was a big mistake. In hindsight, I should have driven to the police station, but for whatever reason, I thought this was the best idea. Going a good deal over the speed limit, I find a turn and begin to slightly brake so I wouldn't turn full speed. But as I was beginning to turn, I hit a patch of black ice and my car slid off the road and into a small ditch. Crap. I didn't want to floor it because I was afraid my car would tip over on its side, so I just sat there in disbelief until I look in my rearview mirror and see the car is now parked on the side of the road with the driver and passenger doors open. Before I knew it, my car door swings open, a man unbuckles my seatbelt and pulls me out the car. I really regret not locking my door because the man and his friends proceed to kick the crap out of me while I'm curled up in a ball and screaming for them to stop. They just keep cussing at me and kicking until they were safely satisfied and get in the car and drive off. At this point I was completely shaken and got back in my car and called for my mum. She told me to call the police and that she was on her way to collect me. The police arrived, but I didn't have much to tell them other than 2 guys in a sedan followed me from that neighborhood and beat me up. It was dark, so I didn't know what kind of car it was or what they looked like, so the cops never found out who did it. If I had just driven to the police station instead of trying to lose them myself, I could have saved myself a lot of pain.
I work as a nurse in a psychiatric unit, which is conveniently tucked away around the back of an old hospital. I'm on night shift at the moment, and most of the night is spent trying to convince manic patients to return to their beds. We were having a strangely quiet night. The staff usually sit in the corridor at the intersection between the male and female sides of the ward. We can hear everything that's going on better from there, and intervene quickly if need be. There's a shower room located just to the left of where we sit. It has a toilet and short wall partitions separating the showers from the far corner of the room. As we were sitting there, the doors to the shower room slowly crept open. No big deal. We got up, closed it again, and went on with the night. It happened again, and about an hour later again. We thought nothing of it. After closing the door a second time, though, we soon heard the sounds of running water. I got up to check and found the tap in the shower room was running. I thought it must have been faulty, but when I tried to turn it off, it spun easily and stopped running water. Feeling a little freaked out now, I checked around the partition of the shower in case a client was, somehow, hiding there, but there was no one. When I turned to walk back, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck and heard what sounded like gas hissing behind me. I glanced back around and checked the shower, which seemed to work fine, and just assumed there was trapped air or something happening. The next night we were sitting in the same place, and again it was an unusually quiet night, until around 2 a.m, when we heard a massive bang and then a dull thud, as if something had hit against a wall and then slid to the floor. The noise seemed to be quite close, and we hurriedly looked through each dormitory and individual patient's room, expecting that one of the patients had fallen, but everyone was still soundly asleep, apart from one patient who told us she had trouble sleeping the last few nights and asked to watch some television in the sitting room. We continued with our search but couldn't seem to find anything to explain the sound, and sat back down in the corridor where we started to talk about ghosts and joking about being haunted. The patient, who couldn't sleep, asked if she could smoke in the toilet. We occasionally let people do this during the night as we aren't allowed to let them out of the unit after 10 p.m, and trying to tell an avid smoker they can't have a cigarette is a sure way to start a fight that'll cause everyone to wake up. We said she could have a quick one in the shower room before going back to bed, and she asked for one of us to come in with her. When we asked why, she explained that it's because it freaks her out, that there are spirits in there that are trying to come through the mirror. We hear stuff like this all the time from patients on a regular basis, so we don't think much of it, offered her some reassurance and agreed to go to the bathroom with her. While we were in there, she talked about seeing the ghost of a man in her room, which kept her up at night. She then stopped talking abruptly and looked confused before going over to peer around the partition. I asked her what was wrong and she shushed me and asked me in a whisper if I heard what she heard. I admitted I couldn't hear anything. Again, it's a common occurrence for people to talk about auditory hallucinations on our ward, but asked her what she could hear. She said she thought she heard a dripping sound, but there was no running water, and when she checked behind the partition, she heard a hissing sound. I suggested she finish her cigarette and go back to bed, and she asked for some medication to calm her down, then said, Man, I hate that bathroom. The door opens and closes itself, you know. After she went back to bed, I was telling the other staff about this, and we were joking about how much of a freaky coincidence it all was. We were still discussing it when day staff came in. When the first nurse arrived, she came over to ask us how the shift was, and we asked her if she believed in ghosts in a jokey way. She said she didn't, but that she had some bad memories of the wards that really freaked her out. She told us the worst thing she ever saw was 20 years ago when she was doing the hourly checks on the ward, just to check on each patient every hour to make sure they're okay. She couldn't find one patient and went to the shower room because she could hear running water. She checked around the partition and found the guy lying dead in a pool of blood in the shower. He had hacked himself to death with 2 blades, an obviously very unwell man. The nurse told us that ever since that happened a few times she's gone into the shower room and felt a sudden rush of cold air. It was like someone was trying to run past her. I was on night shift when this following story happened. There's usually skeleton staff on over the night, 2 trained nurses and 3 or 4 nursing assistants. We had a patient with an eating disorder on the ward. At this time she required constant observation to make sure she wasn't micro-exercising or purging. At night, we'd usually wait until she'd fallen asleep, and then position a member of staff just outside the dormitory she shared with 3 other patients, so that patients had a little more privacy to sleep throughout the night. Our ward is in a T-shape, with a male corridor and a female corridor at either end, and the nursing station at the center. We all sat at the center of the T-junction, so we could see and hear down each end of the corridor, and we had one member of staff sat outside the female dormitory at the very end of the female corridor. The chair the staff member sat on had its back to the fire door at the end of the corridor. Facing along towards us, we all took turns sitting there overnight. It was a fairly quiet night, with all patients sleeping soundly. A rarity in most cases. We usually had whispered conversations in the corridors amongst each other just to keep us going, and on one occasion I was sitting on the observation chatting with a colleague when she looked up behind me confused. I asked her what was up, and she said she thought she saw someone moving on the outer side of the fire door. There was a small round window on the door looking out at the trees and path leading around to the bins and back of the unit. I told her to stop creeping me out, and we laughed about it, talking about the last night we had when all this stuff happened, when she looked up startled. She said she was positive something moved past the glass, and she dared me to get up and look outside. I was in the middle of not so politely declining this request when I heard a thud on the fire door behind me like it had just been kicked. I froze and we exchanged looks of horror, just as there was a very gentle knock at the door. Needless to say, we both freaked. I jumped out of my chair, and she came hurrying towards me, both of us full of nervous giggles. It took some persuasion from both of us before we managed to go and look out the window. Of course, there was nothing there. The night went on, and we continued to joke and speculate about what we saw and heard. She brought a chair up to sit next to me, outside the dormitory, for emotional support, and I insisted I wasn't going to look out the window for the rest of the night. A few hours later, someone else was sat on the observation, and I was chatting in the middle of the junction with another nurse. One of our colleagues steps out of the office at the junction, looks up at the corridor and gasps. She pointed at the fire door and said she was sure she saw someone with a pale face staring through the window before it vanished. A new round of speculation started, as we theorized as to what it could be, when the door to the female dormitory burst open and a patient came stumbling out of the corridor, running past the nurse's assistant on the observation and straight to the corridor at us. She looked terrified and half asleep, so we assumed she was sleepwalking. We caught her as she reached us at the junction and began attempting to soothe her, but she kept trying to push past our hands, muttering in a scared voice, "No, there's someone there. There's someone there." We eventually tried to engage with her, but she was either in too deep a sleep or too groggy. Eventually, we managed to calm her down and return her to the dormitory, but when she got to her bed, she stopped again and asked if the nurse had to stand over her all night. We assured her there was no one standing over her all night, and she looked confused but allowed us to settle her into bed, where she promptly fell asleep. Our adrenaline was running high at this point, and matters weren't helped when the haunted tap started playing up again, turning itself on in the cursed bathroom. We were so freaked out, one of the nurses refused to walk around the ward on her own while others remained skeptical about all of it. It was maybe a week later when we were back on shift, when we had the same setup, with one member of staff sat alone at the observation and the rest of us in the middle of the corridor, when a nursing assistant, who hadn't been there the first night, stepped out of the office behind us and shouted, "Who the hell is that?" She was loud enough to make us all jump, and we looked down the corridor to where she was pointing at the fire door, and a poor, pale, freaked out staff member sat in front of it. The nursing assistant then explained that, as she had stepped out the office, she had glanced at the fire door and thought she saw something white shining in. She then did a double take and realized it was a pale face of a blonde woman pressed up against the window. The nursing assistant said that she had shouted and the face dropped down, as if the person or whatever it was had fallen. We all went together to peer out, and of course there was nothing there. I called the site manager. There was always one manager on call at nights to handle any big issues, and suggested there may have been a person going around the building looking through the windows. She didn't seem that concerned with the story, and just suggested that no staff leave the building until morning, which is a typical rule anyway. Of course, a paranormal encounter isn't the only explanation for this. A living, breathing person going around staring through our windows was creepy enough, especially since the fire door didn't have a lock and was often blown open by the wind. Another week or so passed, and a different staff rotated on shift. I told one of the nurses all the stories that had happened to us on the shift, and she was petrified, saying that she always got an eerie feeling on the ward at night. Later that night, a member of staff from another ward on the unit popped in to borrow something. He had worked at the hospital for almost 30 years and had been in every ward on the unit at some point. The nurse I was working with told him that she was freaked out and asked if he had experienced any hauntings on the ward. He seemed amused and asked, "Like what?" She told him about the taps turning on and off, about the patient claiming there were spirits in the mirrors. He seemed skeptical and shrugged it off, but agreed it was a new one to him. He then said he'd never had any hauntings or weird experiences on the ward, but said that a lot of the staff through the years had complained about spooky stuff always happening at the female dormitory at the end of the corridor. Again, I'm not necessarily claiming it all had ghosts or something, but it was definitely unsettling, to say the least, while on night shift. One summer, I was running a poker league in the recreation center of a retirement complex. The property was built on land where my friend's grandfather used to have a flowery nursery many years ago. Despite it being brand new, it was a seriously creepy building. My skin would just crawl just being there. Lights would flicker, it was cold all the time, and it wasn't comfortable. You could just feel something was there. One night, after the players had left, I was hurried cleaning up, so I couldn't get out of there as fast as I would have liked to. I was ready to go, and was halfway to the door when I realized I'd forgotten my keys, and was heading back out when someone cleared their throat in my ear. It sounded like a man. It was deep and directly in my left ear, unmistakable. I bolted, left the doors unlocked, lights on, jumped in my car and drove home to get to my boyfriend at the time. He came back with me and checked the place out, and there was no one there. Months later, I caught up with a friend whose grandfather had owned the nursery. I told her the story of the night and how scared I was. She looked at me like I was pulling her leg and proceeded to tell me that when her grandfather had passed away, her aunt had come home for the funeral. She insisted on sleeping in his bed for the night, and when she woke up the next morning, she told her family how she had heard her father clearing his throat throughout the whole night. I worked the night shift, at a live-in drug rehab. We have kids newborn to 6 years. I was shampooing one of our daycare members and had the door propped open with a heavy metal chair. One of our children, an adorable little blonde girl in a white dress-styled nightgown, had come out of her room and was under the chair. It was around 3 a.m., and I yelled at her to get her little pup back to bed. She giggled and ran down the hall. I turned off the machine and followed her but didn't see her. I went into her and her mum's room to make sure she'd gotten to bed. She was in fact already in bed, fast asleep, in matching shirt and pajama pants. There's no way she could have got changed that quickly. I'd recently gone back to my home state for a visit, after roughly a year and a half away. I caught up with a few friends on my first night, and shot the breeze of dinner and billiards. I'd come to find my friend Tony has changed his mind about attending community college, and decided to try his hand at pursuing a childhood dream instead. He didn't really get into much detail at the time. As a matter of fact, the conversation started towards the end of the night. I made it a point to mention that I needed to go and rent a hotel room. Tony wasn't having it. Nope. I'd be a pretty crap friend if I let you drive off right now. I'm only 3 miles away, and I converted my old bedroom into an office and guest sleeping area after my brother moved out. Save your cash. Tony and I had been friends since the 7th grade. As a matter of fact, we're still friends to this day. Like me, he was a quiet kid, at least at first. His uncle worked at our old school as a teacher's aide, and I overheard them talking about a mutual interest one day. Classic punk rock. I was doing my best not to eavesdrop, but then they started talking about The Damned. I joined in on the conversation, and that's how he became one of my closest friends in the world. So back to the evening at hand, I accepted his offer and followed him back to his house. We must have sat up for another 3 hours, just reminiscing before I crashed for the night. I got off the following morning, and am greeted by the smell of fresh coffee and blueberry muffins. Tony asks me how I slept, and I told him pretty well, and poured myself a mug of hot bean water life elixir. So do you have plans for today? You mentioned you only have today and tomorrow off work. I look at Tony and sip my coffee. I was thinking of going down to Wildwood, or possibly Ocean City. Figured I'd check out the old stomping ground and see whatever Gateway 26 has to offer. Tony nodded and took a bite of his muffin. Sounds like a plan. You think you could be back this way around 5? He said while producing a ticket from his shirt pocket. He handed it to me, and it was for some indie wrestling show at Moose Lodge. I eyed down the piece of paper and thought about it for a minute. Sure, could be fun. I folded the ticket up and placed it within my wallet. After finishing breakfast, I wrote down the directions Tony gave me, and then I made my way to the boardwalk. Knowing I would have to be up at 5, I opted to go to Ocean City. After enjoying some time at the arcades and devouring a few slices of heavenly pizza, I killed some time just meandering and taking in the sights. It was close to 3:30 when I made my way back to my car and made the journey to Moose Lodge. Upon arriving, I looked all over the place for Tony to no avail. I figured maybe I'd arrived a little too early, so I pulled the ticket out of my wallet and handed it to the lodge employee, tending to the front door. I get inside and begin looking around the crowd. There were perhaps 50 people. I have been to a few of these indie shows, and I can honestly say the crowd turnout has always been relatively small. This was one of the smallest. As I'm surveying my surroundings, I see it. The back of a wheelchair absolutely plastered in punk band stickers. In it, an older gentleman in his late 40s or early 50s, with bleach, blonde, Billy Idol hair and a leather jacket, loaded with pyramid studs and Punk's Not Dead, airbrushed on the back. Uncle Frank! I yell at the top of my lungs. The man in the wheelchair looks at me and shoots me an ear-to-ear grin. Get your butt over here and give your uncle a hug. When you're done, cop and squat right here. He pointed to the chair on his left. I made my way over to Frank, and he gave me a hug so tight he damn near dropped my back. I took my seat and asked him if he'd seen Tony. He said he was around here somewhere, and that he thought he'd gone to grab some cheesesteaks from the concession. As if the timing couldn't be any more perfect, Tony sat down at the chair to the right of his uncle and handed me the thing I planned to make my dinner later on tonight. We sat there watching some good independent talent shows. Lots of flippy stuff on the ropes, tons of crowd interaction. They really wanted to make sure the crowd got their money's worth. When the show was approaching its second hour, it happened. Now, I don't remember the wrestler's name. I could tell you he looked like King Kong Bundy with a mullet. He stood roughly 6 foot tall, and he was well over 300 pounds, an absolute mountain of a man. His opponent was some kid that was maybe 21 years old, and looked like he weighed 170 pounds soaking wet. The mountain man threw him around the ring like a training dummy, and proceeded to beat the ever-loving living hell out of him throughout the insanely short match before leveling him with what looked like a rock bottom from the second rope. 1, 2, 3, the match was over. Obviously this man was playing the part of the heel, and boy was he getting into it. He climbed out of the ring and proceeded to talk smack to the crowd, even getting a few people's faces. But when he got to Tony, the mood completely changed. Things stopped being entertaining. Now, if you'll humor me for a moment, let me just say I stand at 5'9", and at the time I weighed 180 pounds. I'm not a big guy, never have been, and certainly don't look my age. This was probably my one and only saving grace. This guy gets in Tony's face, and he shot the big guy a look back before telling him to go piss off. Big guy takes offense, slapped Tony's disposable cup of Dr. Pepper out of his hand, splashing it all over his uncle in the process. Tony goes over the makeshift guardrail. He then rips off Tony's shirt and start lighting up his chest and back with open-handed overhand chops. Everything's in slow motion at this point, and I get the bright idea to hop the guardrail and punch this guy in the back of the head. Everything went quiet, and I zeroed in on his expression, on his face, as he turned his attention to me. This is how I die, was the most prevalent thought in my head at the time. Before anything could happen, I felt 2 hands go under my armpits and grasp my shoulders. Security began dragging me out. As I looked down towards Tony and Frank, they were yelling something I couldn't make out. The security guard looked at me and told me point blank I was lucky. I was a kid, otherwise he would have let the wrestler get a few good shots on me. I told the guard I would stay outside my car, but I wanted to make sure my friends were okay. They told me that would be fine, as I waited, and waited, and waited. People began making their way to their cars and driving off as the show was over. I was looking all around for Tony but didn't see him. Finally, I see Frank wheeling his way through the door with a look on his face. I couldn't quite pinpoint what it was supposed to mean. It was something between bewilderment and fighting the urge to laugh. "Wow, you know how to melt this old New York punk's heart. You got your ass kicked out there trying to take on the equivalent of human Godzilla. I'd say you have a death wish, but I know why you did it. Proud of you, man." Frank patted me on the arm, and I asked him where his nephew was. "Tony's fine, he hit his head. He should be out any minute." I nodded at Frank and watched his expression change to one of horror. As I turn around, I see the wrestler I donkey punched. His GMC Jimmy was parked next to my car. He grabbed me by the jacket and pushed me against his vehicle while winding me up to give me a receipt. At this point, I closed my eyes and accepted it. Much like a fly hitting a windshield, the last thing to go through my mind was going to be my arse, as this man punched it through my colon. I braced myself for impact, and then it happened. It was like a raindrop hitting me in the face. I opened my eyes to see Tony standing next to this shaven Sasquatch, and they're both busting a gut. "That's how you throw a worked punch." And he lets go of my jacket and brushes me off. Tony then explained to me he had been there since 2, working with the large man I now know as Mike. They planned out the whole thing. Mike was Tony's trainer, and this evening was supposed to be a storyline beating that would lead to Tony's first ring-in match in about a month's time, for those of you keeping score. Tony was what is known as a plant in the sports entertainment, and yet he forgot to tell me this whole ordeal would happen. Maybe he was just trying to help sell the moment. Maybe he genuinely forgot, but I honestly can't say. That was one of my brightest moments. Tony followed his childhood dream for a little while. I'd like to say about 4 years, but unfortunately indie wrestling shows don't really pay the bills and they take a huge toll on your body. Today he works as a 911 dispatcher. Occasionally we talk about his wrestling days and glance over it every now and again. Mike, you human horror movie with a weird sense of humor. Should we ever meet again, I honestly hope you buy me a drink after all that. And thank you for not turning my innards into outards. Just dumb kid stuff, right? I work the overnight shift at my local hardware store. Let's call it Gnome Depot for anonymity's sake. Every so often in certain areas there will be some weird things that happen, such as boxes falling off perfectly flat carpets, products that will fall off their hooks, disembodied footsteps, some faint voices, and an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Also, there's sometimes a faint smell of perfume coming from that area, while some of it could very well be other associates in the store. We have about 6 to 10 associates in the store all night. We all usually keep to our own departments and don't go wandering off. The area in question is also kind of out of the way of any area most associates would go to, such as the break room / time clock, etc. So we don't usually go there unless we have to. I grew up in a small town with no more than a few stoplights and a few thousand residents in the Great Basin Desert of the western US. For those of you who have never been, you cannot begin to understand just how vast and isolated you can become in my home state. It's a breeding ground for strange people to hide out from the law, keep to themselves, and do whatever it is they do, and remain a secret. As someone who frequently spends days exploring isolated, vast stretches of desert, hours away from cell service in some cases, I unfortunately have a few stories where I was held at gunpoint, or thought I was going to be taken. But those stories are for another day. This is my earliest encounter with someone I wish to never meet. The valley where this story takes place is one where they found a family murdered. Just a few months prior to this encounter, in fact. It will give you a feel for what happens in the desert. I was roughly 12 at the time and I'm 22 now. I was with my mom and 3 younger brothers. My dad and uncle were prospecting for gold and we got bored. So we thought we'd go hike down into the valley to an abandoned miner's shack about 2 miles away. No biggie. We've done this many times in the past and it's cool to see the old ruins. But note, my dad and uncle had the pistols. We did not. We get down there with no issue, and the shack looks clearly abandoned and in disrepair. It appears to be from the 1930s and is resting on a small hill with a dirt road leading to it. We go inside and explore, and all is good, till I see on one of the old shelves brand new canned goods, fresh paper wrappers and all. I thought to myself that it was odd. Perhaps some backpackers left them for the next guy. But boy, was I wrong. We kept exploring this house until I come into a room and see something that I will never forget. The feeling you get when you instantly know something is horribly wrong. And that stuck with me hard. That room had a fresh house cat hung from the rafters of the ceiling with its abdomen split open and the intestines hanging out. It had to have been only a few days old. I never let my mum or brother see it. I just ran to the room that they were in and said that we had to leave. I said I had a bad feeling from those cans. We get out the house and we're about 50 feet away when my brother insists he needs to go to the bathroom. I didn't tell him what I saw because I knew it would freak him out, and he had to go. So here we are, a baseball throw away from this house, and my brother is going to the bathroom. Just as he finishes from the back side of the hill that the shack is on, comes an old white beat-up van, and I remember thinking that this is it. I will never see my dad again. They'll never know what happened to us. Out of the van, I vividly remember seeing 4 men step out and look in our general direction. I picked up my youngest brother, and my mum the other 2,
and we took off running. I've never felt more scared in my life. I didn't dare look back to see if they were trailing after us. I couldn't make myself. After what feels like forever, we finally get out the valley and meet up with my dad and uncle. We tell them our story, and we get the hell out of there. To this day, I still can't help but wonder if I'd be alive today had I not seen the dead cat before those guys got to the shack. So to the men, mutilating cats in the desert, let's never meet again.
I work in a library, and on weekdays we have to go through the building and turn off all the lights. I always hated this. I'm super jumpy, but I always somehow got scheduled only closing shift. One night just after midnight, because we have to wait until it's officially closed, I was going about this routine, and we have study rooms that people can rent out. I knew they were empty because all the keys were checked back in, but out of the corner of my eye I saw movement in one. These lights are motion activated, so that's what caught my attention. I reluctantly go look and there's nothing in there. I continue about my task, and lights in the other study rooms keep turning on. It's absolutely freaky, and I never got an answer onto what happened next, except my boss told me that he's gotten reports of weird stuff happening in there. So in my opinion, the place is definitely haunted.
This happened about 3 months ago, and it still comes up in conversation because we just genuinely don't know what happened or what was about to happen to us. It was around 7 p.m. in November, and it was dark in Metro Detroit. I was driving and my fiancée was riding shotgun. We were exiting a pretty populated highway when we turned onto a mile road near the city shopping mall and outlet centers. Being in close proximity to the mall, it was strange the boulevard was that empty at this time of night. So we're driving on the deserted westbound side of the boulevard when we noticed there was a stopped and running vehicle in the middle lane. Again, it was dark aside from the streetlights that lined the road every 80 yards or so, but their brake lights were obviously lit, and we were approaching quick. My fiancé and I were talking in the car at the time when we both kind of stopped to verbally question what we were both seeing. It was strange behavior, especially since the speed limit was 45 to 50 on this mile road, so you don't want to be stopped, especially this close to people exiting the highway. So we slowed down since we're cautious drivers. We approached and passed the vehicle on the far left lane as it was in the middle, and when we were about a car length away from it, the driver gunned it and started speeding to catch us up. We never left our left-hand lane, but at this point I was braking again because the behavior was off and we noticed their driving was so sporadic. Braking was almost instinctual, as much as it probably wasn't safe to do so. Continuing to drive down this mile road with still no traffic we can see in either direction, we noticed the driver was swerving their car between the middle lane and the left lane, as if trying to intentionally sideswipe us. Instant red flag. It wasn't like the driver was intoxicated or texting and just doing a poor job at staying in their lane. This was a driver in control of their swerving and coming dangerously close to hitting the side of my Jeep, going 45 miles an hour. Bad vibes. Before we knew it, we were blinded by a spotlight coming from the driver's window into my car via the passenger window. I have 20 tints on my Jeep windows, which usually help control the brightness of the sun most mornings and evenings. And even when the tints, this spotlight stunned us and we couldn't see anything but white. I didn't have time to check my mirrors before slamming on my brakes. Not sure I would have been able to see in my mirrors after being blinded. I remember my fiancé screaming, "What the hell?" And we opened our eyes and the driver was yards ahead of us, speeding to get away. My fiancé dialed 911 immediately. I don't take crap, so I started racing down the road to catch him up for a license plate number. In Michigan, we have Michigan left turn lanes, and I could see the vehicle up ahead turning into one to enter the mall parking lot, which is a huge roundabout. The roundabout speed limit is about 25 miles an hour, with frequent stop signs in intersections. My fiancée connected with dispatch on the phone as I was trying desperately to catch up to this vehicle. They were blowing red lights and stop signs in sight. Dispatch recommended we don't follow, but I kind of did anyway because I was really upset and committed to grabbing their plate number, but from a safe distance and at a safe speed. No way was I going to tail this person when I didn't know if they had a weapon or something. Long story short, this driver knew we were following them, and they were speeding through the roundabout, cutting drivers off and blowing intersections when we lost sight of them. At this point, the police said there were cops in the area that were already on their way looking for the vehicle we described, and that we should leave it to them. We weren't going to jeopardize our safety and the safety of other drivers just because I was angry. So we stopped our chase but still crossed an intersection into another shopping center across the street when we saw the driver enter. We figured we could prowl instead of chase in case we saw them again. But we never found the car. Never found out who the driver was, what his motives were, or if the cops found him. We knew he was a male because we saw him through the driver's side window before he blinded us. White, male, dark ball cap. He drove a dark sedan. Looked like a newer Ford Fusion. It was a close run-in, and I'm not sure what would have happened if he'd have successfully crashed into us on that deserted mile road, or if his spotlight had successfully veered my car off the road. To the dude who scared the crap out of us and took away our eyesight while driving a moving vehicle, let's not meet again.
I work in high-end security. I was protecting a client's residence and was alone on the property in the guard shack. The guard shack is a small building close to but detached from the main mansion. It was around 1 a.m. and the building was locked tight and armed. I received a phone call from the house line coming from the staff room. I answered the phone and there was nothing but silence. I immediately went to the area and found the room empty. I swept the area and that floor of the house but found nothing. I went back to the shack. 5 minutes later, I get another call on the phone from the house, this time from the spooky basement. Nothing on the other line, just silence. I loaded a round in my gun and went into the basement. I checked every corner and then every inch of the house and found nothing at all. It never happened again after that. That house creeped me out, and most of the other security agents also had spooky happenings there. I am an armed, uniformed security officer in my city. Well, 2 years ago, my company was providing services for a motel named the Night's Inn. The motel was preparing to shut down for a massive remodel, as well as code and structural updates. Now, the motel was previously 2 separate motels, but when the Night's Inn bought it, they merged the properties into one. During nearly 20 years of running between both of the original motels, they saw some rather negative events. This location just happens to be within walking distance from the county jail, so when a number of persons were released from custody, they found their way over to this motel over the years. Murders, drug overdoses, and suicides were all reported on this property. All these dark events left negative imprints on these grounds. Fast forward to when I worked on the property during the overnight hours. And the 3 events during these separate shifts I worked, and the one I responded to as a cover officer. The first few went very slowly and boring. No one had told my staff the history of the property at this point. Well, the second to last week of operation, I was helping the on-duty night auditor prepare the morning breakfast spa, and the kitchen was in part of the building where a long shut-down restaurant once was. The auditor was preparing the waffle batter and filling pitchers of orange juice, when an unopened 12-pack of canned soda exploded next to a service access stairwell that was padlocked from inside of the service hallway to the kitchen. The auditor's scream was chilling, as well as deafening. Well, due to some of the less than upstanding guests they'd rent rooms to, I began down the stairs to find that the doors were still secure, and no one could have entered through them. I then stuck my finger in the puddle of soda, thinking that maybe it had been overheated or something causing them to burst, but no, it was slightly cool. As I look at the auditor still shaking, holding a small kitchen knife trying to calm her down, we both heard a loud little girl giggle, but it sounded unusual. We, needless to say, both bolted from the kitchen and back to the main desk. 5 minutes later, the auditor told me, "No one has checked in any kids tonight." The following weeks, and the last week of the location being open before the remodel, I was doing standard ground patrols, making sure no doors were unsecured or people fighting. Just around the time I finish, I get a call from the front desk calling a Code 6 priority. I ran back to the office, nearly tripping on the staircase in the courtyard. Once I arrived, I saw a young woman with her daughter, just the cutest little 3-year-old. The mother was crying uncontrollably, but managed to tell me her husband was not himself, that after nearly an hour in the room he pulled a knife out of nowhere and started wildly swinging it in the room and at his wife and kid. The wife said that he hates weapons and wouldn't have had one. So I began searching the grounds for the man and found him sitting in a dark corner of the courtyard area. He had the knife in his hand and was blankly staring ahead. Once the knife hit the light, I saw the blood. Then I noticed he was bleeding. I ordered he drop the knife and he slowly started walking towards me. I repeated a second time and then on the third order drew my weapon and ordered that he stop to think about his kid. Right as I did, 3 local officers sprang from behind me, 2 with their tasers drawn. In a quick happening display, I heard the deputy order, then followed taser, taser, taser. The local officer took the man into custody and was having me fill out statements when I overheard 2 of the deputies saying, "You know what, Sard? The room they are staying in had a suspicious death a few days ago, but detectives say it was a drug-induced suicide." The other deputy replied, "Huh? What are the odds this guy went nuts?" I personally think that it's a little too odd that the man commits suicide. Comes to find he cut his arms until he bled out, and then a week later a man loses his mind, cuts himself up, is unresponsive the whole time that he was being spoken to, and was just generally out of it. The most damning paranormal event in my opinion that happened was the first week closed for remodeling. I was walking around the inside and another officer stopped in to hang out on his break. I made the suggestion that we sit in the old restaurant and see if the place was for real haunted. He agreed, reluctantly. Using a spirit box app on my phone that before that night I thought I overpaid for, we sat and asked questions. For about 20 minutes nothing came through, and we joked that maybe the place wasn't haunted after all. I thought I saw something across the room, so I tried to light it up, but come to find that my flashlight battery had suddenly died. So while sitting at the table I pulled my taser out of the holster, and we sat in near pitch darkness in the room, and we used it to light it up. Instantly, the spirit box said, "Yellow, gun," in the same voice. Now mind you, me and this officer thought we had the same level of training, and we were fully certified through the city. But his response was, "The hell does it mean by yellow gun?" I then proceeded to place my taser on the table and turned its light on. I had never heard so many F-bombs as he stormed out the room. The final incident I'm still unsure of, but the one phrase the suspect yelled, "There will be more ghosts here tonight if you enter." 4 weeks after that motel closed, I was working a city patrol when the on-duty officer called for priority backup for all available officers on duty. "Sam 262 to Nights In. What's the situation?" The officer responded. 4 to 6 persons had made enter into the back building and barricaded themselves in a room. I was the first responding officer just after 3 a.m. and meet with the on-duty site officer. As we're talking and a third officer arrived, we heard 3 gunshots ring out from down the hallway. At this time, we contacted the local sheriff's office about the situation. Within minutes, several deputies arrived in active shooter vests and helmets. They attempted to reach the room as we watched from the end of the hallway. 5 more shots rang out from the doorway, and luckily no one was struck. The deputies fell back to the end of the hallway where the 3 of us were. A supervisor for the deputies ordered 4 to watch the hallway as the rest took positions around the building. We asked what they needed to do, and he replied to block the entrances to the property, and no one comes that isn't an officer. So basically we were to keep out of the way of the impending reporters. SWAT arrived, and the deputies pulled back, and SWAT took position. The whole time the suspects saw the activity from the window and holes in the door. A lieutenant with the SWAT and Public Relations Office came over to me and the other guys on my staff, and while asking us what happened before, the deputy responded that we all heard from a broken window, "There will be more ghosts if you enter here tonight." Around 5 a.m. a SWAT team armored vehicle pulled up next to the back of the building, and we heard 3 thumps. SWAT shot OC shells into the room before breaching from the window doorway, and just as soon as we heard the thumps, we see the smoke and 5 of the suspects being carried out. A 6th was being rushed out on a straightboard to the ambulance. We come to find the man with the pistol in the room took his 5 friends hostage and attempted to kill himself when SWAT breached. He later died at the hospital, so I wonder if he joined the other ghosts in the motel. After that night, we no longer provided security at the Night's Inn. 8 months later, it reopened as some new age hipster hotel, and I haven't been to the property for some time now, even though I pass it whenever I work our South City patrol. I wonder how the property is, and if the paranormal activity persisted after the remodeling. I worked about 3 months full-time at McDonald's night shift. The first week, some cooked-up man looked at my name tag and said, "Hey, Mary, I'll wait until these doors open and cut you up into pieces." So I removed my name tag after that. The second week, someone grabbed my tie and tried to punch me, but I had the reflexes to close the drive-thru on his hand first, and removed my tie after. The third week, I got my first drunk driver. The guy had an open 40-ounce bottle of vodka between his lap, and I called the police so that they could pick him up. Happened once a week after that, in general. There's a lot more, but working nights is just awful. People are horrible when it's dark outside. More horrible than usual, anyway. I was 12, and I had come down with a suspected case of glandular fever. So Mum booked me in with our family GP. Mum loved him since he had delivered my sister 8 years earlier, and we had been seeing him ever since. Mum and I are in the waiting room. She's flipping through the terrible magazines, and I'm just watching the fish in the tank. The receptionist pops her head out and calls my name, so Mum turns to me and says, "You're old enough to go in by yourself." A bad feeling hit the pit of my stomach. I shake my head and insist she comes with me. There was never a nurse or anyone else present during appointments, and there was no way I was going in alone. Now, nothing weird had ever happened with our doctor before. He was always professional and kind, but this time I felt uneasy. He was checking my lymph nodes for inflammation. The neck ones were swollen. Then he checked my armpits. Swollen. I'm getting a weird vibe, a bad vibe, like he was enjoying it. Mum didn't notice. Finally, he checks my groin. Swollen. I was very uncomfortable with him at this point. It just felt weird. Bad gut feeling. Diagnosis: glandular fever. We left, and I didn't say anything about the experience. But a few months later, our doctor abruptly left the practice. The new doctor was a lovely lady, and I breathed a sigh of relief to see him gone. 4 years later, Mum comes into my room. "Remember Dr. Gardner? Well, he's in jail for molesting his friend's kids while they were all away on holiday," she tells me with surprise. No. I relate my experience to her and she was shocked. She had no idea. That was weird in itself, as Mum has had weird premonitions over the years. So glad I insisted that Mum accompany me with a pedo doctor. Could have been a lot worse than just the bad gut feeling. I worked overnights at Walmart. The parking lots were always empty, beside the random once-in-a-while dudes who would park up and sleep. One night I was chilling in my car on my lunch break when I noticed some headlights turn on behind me. They stayed on for a bit, then eventually turned off, but when I looked up I noticed there was no car, not even pulling out or anything. I was terrified to go back inside, thinking I was just going to get swooped up and kidnapped, so I sat there for the rest of my break, looking in all directions to make sure I wasn't going crazy, but I never saw the car, only the lights. I still think about it randomly, and my boyfriend tries to write it off as maybe it was street lights far in the distance making it look like it was bright behind you. But no, it was like 10 feet behind me, as if someone had pulled up a light, then poof, just gone. I wish I could explain it.
I'm a 15-year-old male, and I live in an apartment with my parents, younger brother, elder cousin, and grandfather. However, all of these people had gone over to a party, which, because of tuition, I couldn't attend. Now, one thing to bear in mind is that I'm a huge WWE fan. Anyway, I was coming up the elevator, which was on the far end of the hall, and as soon as the door opened I saw a man at the other end, probably around 5'10", just as tall as me. He was wearing a mask, but the creepy part was that it was a mask with devilish goat horns. Now my house is right in the middle of the lobby, and I'm pretty spooked by his mask, but hey, everyone has to wear one, and maybe he's being creative. But that all changed when he tilted his head and from a back pocket produced a vicious-looking knife. You should know that we are both at the end of our respective lobbies. He hadn't moved, and my ass was about to move hard. I ran and tried to get to my door before him, but he was surprisingly fast and able to cover a similar distance to me. When I realized that I wouldn't be able to reach it first, and that I would still need time to unlock my door, that's where my WWE comes to save me. As I see he closing in on me, I hit him with a move called the spear, which is basically running into your opponent's belly with your shoulder. He was coming pretty fast, so I took advantage of the speed and crashed him with the spear. I then quickly opened the door and locked it. I called my dad before the police because, well, I don't know why, but of course by the time that they reached them, he was gone. It still terrifies me to think what would have happened if I hadn't have trusted a wrestling move with my life. Every weekday, I would wake up early at around 5 a.m. for a morning workout, then head to my job. Generally, I would leave my house around 5:30 because my morning drive took about 25 to 30 minutes, giving me enough time for 2 hours before I needed to leave before my shift started. Most of my drive was just me putting loud music on, trying not to fall asleep, and it being a freeway before 6, almost everyone was going at least 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. I'll drive most of the time on a main interstate before turning off onto a smaller highway, which I would only use for a mile or so. This highway was 3 lanes on each side. People also drive fast on here, but usually not more than 75 miles an hour or so. And while you get some unsafe drivers in the morning, most people aren't swerving erratically. The highway runs north to south. An on-ramp from a main street becomes a lane. Then there are 2 entrances from the freeway. I would take that every day. One from the eastbound side and one from the westbound side. I hope that makes sense, but basically, I got on from the eastbound side, right as 3 cars from the westbound side are entering. One was sort of a orangey sports car, and the other 2 were identical grey sedans. I don't remember exactly what make or model they were, but I remember them being fairly uncommon, not a sedan you see plenty of times a day. The orange car was sandwiched in between the 2. These guys were going at least 80. The orange car would change lanes, and the car in front would cut him off, while the other behind would change lanes to remain behind. They kept this up the entire time I was on the highway near them, weaving in and out of cars, not slowing down before I pulled off at my exit. This could be a complete coincidence and some horrible drivers, but I definitely got the vibe that the driver of the orange car was trying to get away from the grey ones. Maybe it was extreme road rage, or maybe something more sinister. Regardless, grey car drivers, let's not meet.
I used to work as a corrections officer, and I have plenty of really creepy stuff that happened over those 5 years, but this is by far my favorite incident. I was assigned to the single-man cells wing of the jail, which is basically solitary confinement for inmates who are being punished for breaking rules within the jail. At around 5 a.m., medical call for all inmates that need medication to be escorted from my wing to medical to receive their meds. I pull out 2 guys, restrain them, and instruct them to face the wall and await the guard who will be escorting them. As the 3 of us are there, I begin to hear a woman crying. I was new to the jail and didn't think anything of it, so I'm just listening to this woman cry when I slowly start to realize a few things. There are no females in this wing, nor in any other wing where the men are. The female wing is down the hall, sealed tight with about 3 doors in between the hall and the actual wing. There is only about 2 other males in the wing, who are asleep aside from us 3. I look up at the inmates and notice they have this kind of smile on their faces as they're watching me realize what's going on. And I ask them, "Do you guys hear that?" One of the inmates responds, "Almost every night, boss." They went on about other things that would happen in that wing. Water being turned on and off, towels being thrown down on the floor, hearing knocks on the walls. I actually had another incident that night, confirming the knocks heard on the walls in the empty cells. That same night, or rather morning, we were assigned to a certain wing, and we had to do exit door checks, which basically meant going to the exit door of the wing and checking the fire exit door to make sure it was securely fastened, and then radioing it to control every few hours. As I was making my way down a very long hall, with empty single-man cells to my left and right, I could hear knocking at the end of the hall. But it wasn't coming from the exit door, it was coming from one of the cells on the right-hand side. As I would gradually move closer, I could hear the knocks getting louder at the end of the hall. That's when I got to the end of the hall, and the knocking seemed to have gone away. So I grabbed the exit door to make sure it was secure, and a very distinct and loud knock came from the one cell on the right-hand side of me. I'd seen enough horror films to not look into the empty cell and decide it would be best to just get out. I was a lone worker in a building doing IT support, and I hear the buzzer go off at around 2 a.m. So I walk over to the door and I'm about to press the release to open it and ask what the person wants. It was a large business park, so maybe he was looking for a certain building, but as I reached for the buzzer he grabbed the door very quickly, which made me realize what I was about to do. I asked him who he was and he just said, "John." I asked what he wanted and he said he left some files inside. I asked where he left them and I would get them. He said I wouldn't know where they were and he should just grab them. Basically told him to leave after that. I was on edge for the rest of my shift. What the hell did this guy want? Why was he here trying to get in here at 2 a.m.? So many questions and no answers.
Something you need to understand is that, in a lot of ways, my parents are wonderful and I love them. But I had a lot of repressed mental issues as a kid. Well, more than I do now. I was miserable, felt trapped and scared because I knew I could never live up to certain expectations, plus I was a sensitive kid, which unfortunately clashed with my parents' approach of handling things. Not to mention I was basically an outcast in school for years. I decided to run away. I thought that since I hated my life so much, I was already suicidal, and I thought I might as well run away to give it one last shot. I had this whole idea planned out in my head. Stupid move, and naive, I know. And now that we have gotten that out of the way, here's the story. I decided the best way to do it was to be with another person, and coincidentally found a local forum where kids and teenagers were asking for runaway buddies. There were no recent enough posts, so I made one of my own using a fake name and throwaway email address. And after a while I was at my lowest point, I got a reply. He introduced himself as a 20-something-year-old man, if I remember right. I was about 14, and he said he was fed up with society and was putting together a group of runaways to live in the forest together, surviving off nature's gifts. I could see this was all shady, but at the same time I was desperate and not thinking clearly at all, so I reply asking for more details. He asks my phone number and if we can talk. I didn't feel comfortable talking on the phone. I asked if I could get more details first. Which forest were you thinking of? What would we do in winter? How many others have signed up for this? Then he sent a very scary response. Are you stupid? I said, give me your Facebook, with a few choice words added in. His facade had dropped. I didn't respond after that, and neither did he as far as I was aware, as I stopped checking the email after a while. I don't know who he was or what he was really planning for me. Probably the most messed up thing though is that for a moment I actually considered meeting with him. I thought he could do what I couldn't. But I'm much better now. I don't want to even think what could have happened or about the time of my life in general. So, creepy guy on the internet. Let's not meet.
This happened to me about 3 months ago. I work at a Hy-Vee and as a night shift stocker, and it's 2 hours after we close. I'm in the frozen section away from my co-workers, who are in the grocery aisle, and out of nowhere, some guy taps me on the shoulder and says, I fell asleep in the restroom, can you let me out the store? We eventually let him out, but I swear the moment he tapped me on the shoulder and I turned to face him, I almost instinctively tried to run. I think you would have too, if it had happened to you.
Being from a third world country, you see a lot of stuff happening all over. You never think it's going to happen to you. After all, you're careful and you know better. You mind your own business, and everything's going to go 5 by 5. My mom is one of the strongest women I know. She's one of 15 siblings, which I think toughened her up and made her a woman of strong morals and no nonsense. She's one of the eldest of her siblings, so she has that nurturing mama bear thing down. She'll take crap from no one, and when confronted with fight or flight, she'll fight every single time. Like the one time my mum was picking up my sister from kindergarten, and some guy tried to snatch her purse. She took notice of him walking towards her with no good intentions, and she told my sister to hold onto her skirt. And when the man made his move, she just pressed her thumbs into the man's eyes and scratched him wherever she could reach. She's gotten mellow later in life, but for me, she's still the epitome of love and strength. This is the story of how I almost lost my mum to road rage. I was 10, it was a Sunday, and I had gone to the swimming pool with my friends. My dad was supposed to pick me up at 5, but by 7 I was fuming, angry, and decided to walk home, as it was probably a 20-minute walk. I got home and was mad, and my sisters were scolding me because it was dark and dangerous for a 10-year-old to be walking home on his own, and my dad had gone to pick me up 5 minutes ago. But I didn't care. I was pissed, and just walked into my parents' room to give my mum a piece of my mind, when I found her sobbing and in distress. I asked her what was going on, and she was angry at my dad and didn't want to talk to him again. My anger faded, and curiosity striked instead. So I asked her. Turns out around 4:30, when my dad was going to pick me up, he was coming back from his farm and some dude cut off my dad, who unfortunately has some road rage, honked his horn, pulled down the window in my mum's side, and yelled a branch of obscenities. The dude in the other car lowered his window, pulled out a gun, and began shooting at my dad's car. Dad hit the brakes and let the other car pull further away. They stopped and got out the car to catch their breath, and that's when my mum saw a hole in the space between the passenger's front door and the passenger's back door. A bullet nearly missed my mum's head, and she was hysterical. They got home and Mum broke down and cried. Dad had to calm her down. That's why they were late to collect me. It's probably not as scary as other stories, but it's been 20 years since that day, and every once in a while I'll think to myself, If there had been a few centimeters in difference, my mum could be dead. And the what if is what scares me every time.
I used to work in a night shift call center. There were only a few other employees on night shift, and the comfort rooms were empty most of the time. So, I was using the toilet, and I knew I was the only one there since I could see all of the other cubicles were empty. I just stepped out of the toilet and into the hallway when I heard footsteps running in my direction from inside the comfort room. I glanced back, but no one was there. From then on, I would always ask one of my co-workers to accompany me there. I was too afraid to go alone.
My mum was dating my dad at the time. I was around 10. He lived with his parents since his dad was sick, and since it wasn't really that far from our house, we thought we'd go visit him there. We had dinner and stayed for a while. He gave us gifts. He gave me a cow plushie, which I still have to this day, and everything goes well. Then it gets late, around 11 p.m, and we decide to leave. It's literally pitch black. Also, I may remind you that it's probably mid-December. There's no snow falling at the moment, so it's icy and you couldn't see your hands in front of your face. So like any normal human beings would, my mum puts her high beams on. Something I forgot to add to this is that she would usually shut them off when she got close to the other cars, and it's not like she was blinding them. She only had them on when she was very far away. You'll understand why I said this in a minute. We get behind this black car in which the driver is acting like a jerk and won't drive normally. They're speeding up to almost 70 and then slowing down to an almost stop. And my mum can't turn because the road we're on is rural and there's nothing but cow fields on either side. There was nowhere to go, so we ended up behind him with an extremely aggravated driver behind us. It's a bit harder to see again, so my mum puts on her high beams, a fair distance away from the car in front. Because you wouldn't do that if you weren't far away. But of course the driver in front of us stops, completely, and then this huge, burly, bigger-built man starts sprinting over to our car at top speed. I start screaming and crying and can see that he's holding a blunt object in his hand. My mum recoils as she fears the worst as she looks around, trying to figure out how she could escape. There's a car coming from the other way, so she can't turn around. His car is in front of us, so she can't hit the gas. There's only fenced-off fields around us, and he pounds on the window like the FBI and starts screaming and swearing. He starts threatening us, saying that he'd kill my mum if he ever caught her with our high beams on again. Of course I'm screaming and crying, and being a small, skinny 10-year-old girl, not knowing if me and my mum were about to get killed, and also knowing full well if she did, I wouldn't know what to do or how to get home, and I didn't have my dad's phone number memorized at the time, and I didn't exactly remember how to work my mum's phone, so I didn't even know how to call my dad to begin with. The man's body language was just off. I'm not sure if he was drunk or high, but it seemed that way. And he looked at me for a second, which scared me and my mum rightfully. My mum is also a very small lady, and our car wasn't very fast, so she wasn't sure what to do because neither fight or flight would work at this point. The blunt object in his hand turned out to be a huge flashlight, which he began to repeatedly hit the window with. He also started flashing the light in my mum's face to blind her. Ironic. My mum yelled at him to get lost as he hit the window harder, about to break it. Thankfully, the car behind us started to lay on the horn, and he got back into his car out of fear and sped off. My mum called out to my dad, who drove around almost all night to look for the guy but didn't find anything. I can't remember if we called the cops or not. I just remember crying into my pillow all night long.
One night I was working very late in the office with one of my co-workers. We were finishing up filing and talking before heading out. Together we went to the lobby, locking up the door, turning everything off, and went back to the mailroom to get the last few things out. While we were talking, we heard heels walking around out the lobby. It sounded like they were just walking around in circles. No one really wears heels at our office either. Thinking it was a director staying late, we quietened down and waited for them to walk by. Hello? Susan? But there was nothing. We just locked those doors and there was no other way for them to go other than to pass us on the way out. We went to look in the lobby, and no one was there, but we both heard it as clear as day. Working late in that building always meant hearing noises and things, but that was the first time we heard something pretty undeniably strange. When I worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour porno store/strip club, on a night, I happened to fortunately not be working. There was an incident in the gay room. Basically, the details I gathered from the people who were working there at the time was that a big guy came in and went into the room. A few minutes later, another dude comes in basically crawling out and crying. He's screaming that there's a man in there sexually assaulting people. Now, I worked with a plethora of jacked bouncers who literally feared nothing except that back room. The bouncers all came up with excuses not to go in there and convinced a cashier friend of mine to do it. So he grabs a baseball bat that we had behind the counter and adventures into what only can be described as a dark, teemingly gay cavern of misdeeds. Now, we were all afraid to get the police involved in this kind of stuff because not only was the place mafia run, but it was also illegal to have a gay room, which was definitely the place's biggest moneymaker. We didn't want the wrath of the cops or mafiosos on us, so we never involved the police. Anyway, he gets inside and this big gentleman is wearing a mask and has all of the dudes there lined up with no pants on, and he's just taking them all, one by one, leaving them bleeding and terrified. My cashier friend Dave walks in there and starts yelling at the dude, "Dude, you can't be doing this back here." The guy starts sobbing, apologizing profusely, and runs out the store. The ambulance arrived shortly after and took a few of the guys to the hospital. This is sadly a true story, and I really hope the people involved didn't catch anything and were okay. As okay as you can be after that, of course. I worked night shift at a memory care facility that was apparently haunted, but it was actually one of the residents that scared me the most. The haunted aspect just added to the creepy tone of the place. We would have to do rounds to check on the residents, which was fine except for someone called Helena. She was at the point in her dementia where she was considered non-verbal. I never actually saw her in the light of day, but every time I opened the door to her room, she was sitting straight up in bed, with her long, black hair completely covering her face like in The Ring. If that wasn't creepy enough, the second she realized you opened her door, she would scream a bloody murder scream until you left. And in the dark, I would have to approach this person and check her briefly to make sure she was dry and clean. And being physically attacked by someone with a memory illness is not uncommon. I quit after about a month, for many reasons, but that was certainly one of the contributing factors. I used to work as a personal trainer at a very familiar gym in my city to help pay for college. The neighborhood this gym was located in has 2 other gyms across the street, so we would have a lot of clients changing from place to place. I worked the night shift since I was out of class at 6 p.m. and worked from 6:30 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. Usually a lot of guys would go for experimental classes at night, and I was known for working with the bodybuilders. At around 9 p.m. this huge guy with a very arrogant posture walked in for an experimental class. The secretary immediately sent him to me, and I was more than happy to help him out, albeit I was pretty sure he already worked out and needed no help whatsoever. Weird, but okay. Throughout the whole hour, the guy would ask me very personal questions: where I lived, if I was single, what's my shoe size, and what I was working as. I politely just tried to keep our conversation focused on training and exercises and stuff. When class was over, he looked at me. "Can I have your number?" "Sorry, but I have a fiancé." "You sure? I don't usually take no as an answer." Already wishing I wasn't at work so I could just walk away. "Yeah, I'm sure, just here to help you exercise properly, nothing else." Then this guy puts his finger at my face and goes, "When I get my gun, "You won't say no to me," and walked out the door. For almost a month, I needed to ask a male co-worker to go with me to the parking lot late at night, because this guy would be at the corner waiting for me to get out. He would stare at me and smile and wait for me to leave. Later, I found out he was at the gym across the street and took my car's license plate. I had to ask one of my clients that was a cop to scare him out. Until this day, I still can't get that smiling face of his out of my mind. I'm a retail worker. My shift started at 6 a.m., which was when we usually unloaded boxes from the trucks that we received that morning or from the previous night. My job was to open up boxes and place/organize their contents into cages that are meant to be taken and worked out on the sales floor by other employees. On this particular day, we had already received our truck the night before, so all I had to do was unpack the boxes. So here I am, 6 a.m. in the morning, all by my absolute self in the back of the store. I had just emptied out a box of stuffed elephant toys that play a lullaby tune when you wind them up. I placed them on the cage and moved them back to the next box, when all of a sudden one of the elephant toys falls to the ground behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. I just turned around and placed it back to where I had originally put it. I carried on emptying out all the contents of the box I'm working on. And just like that, I finished another 2 boxes as well. Again, just to reiterate, this was 6 a.m. in the morning, with not a single soul around. It was still and quiet in my area. As I'm about to start unpacking my 3rd box, I hear something that makes the hairs on my arms stand on end. The elephant lullaby starts to play on its own. And it's not just any lullaby, because that would be too normal. It's a slow, distorted, creepy lullaby sound. I knew instantly that it was the elephant toy, but I couldn't understand how it could play the lullaby on its own when nobody had wound it up, much less why it sounded so creepy. I then hear the toy fall from where I had put it again. I tell you, I have never felt more like a movie character in my entire life. I go to pick up the toy, and as I'm putting it back, I check to see if the other ones make the same sound. Why would anyone want to buy their child a creepy little elephant? But to my horror, the other elephants, when wound up, make a normal lullaby sound. I first thought that the battery was dead. Even so, nobody wound up that toy, so I had no reason to start playing the lullaby on its own. To this day, I can't look at those little stuffed elephants' toys the same. Maybe there's some kind of logical explanation to it, but it does not make it any less creepy in the moment. In the summer of '95, I was a 21-year-old female staying in the 1-bedroom dorm in my college that was kept open for the summer. It was a women's college tucked away between 2 busy urban areas, and we always felt safe on campus. With the sort of energy that makes me feel tired just thinking of it these days, I would walk 1.5 miles to work, a split shift as a waitress, and walk back to the dorm and shower, and then head out to meet friends at our local dive bar and drinks and mischief. My friends were always more about the mischief than I was, since I had a long-distance boyfriend who I was doing a decently good job of remaining faithful to. It was pretty common for a couple of people to peel off from the group and make their way to whatever hookup they were interested in for the night, but we were all being a little more careful right around the time of this story. I looked for confirmation but couldn't find any news stories, and I know for a fact though that there was a serial rapist roaming around the area where we lived and worked and played. No one had a very good description, and people were kind of on edge, making sure no one walked home by themselves at night. 2 a.m. was the last call when you're a certain type of friendly girl, specifically taken, a challenge. The bartenders all fall over themselves to lock you in with them and give you one last drink before you go home. It's not ego, it's just how it was. The night in question, it was just my best friend and I hanging out, drinking hideous things like SoCo and OJ and Captain Morgan's and Diet Coke. Sweet drinks, easy to sip, and easier to chug until your good sense filters away.
My friend Bridget made me promise to let the bartender take her home. She was wandering off with her latest conquest, but I guess still coherent enough to remember that friends didn't make friends walk home at 2:30 a.m. by themselves. I said, yeah, sure, of course I'd get a ride, mentally crossing my fingers. I wasn't going to pay back the free drinks, and I certainly wasn't going to let the nasty bartenders get me alone in a car. She walked away. I had my last drink and let myself out of the bar, waving and saying how I was just fine. It was about 25 minutes to walk. I did it all the time. It was mostly main streets, only a few side roads before turning into the college campus. That was a little dicey there. Now, of course, anyone walking home at night by themselves regularly is going to see a creepy character or two. But I had a secret weapon starting in simplicity itself. Most creepy guys weren't used to being seen, being greeted and smiled at. Trust me, I'm not justifying their creepiness, just saying that it was my instinctive self-protective gambit. 2:30 a.m. I wasn't even thinking about the weirdo from the news. I wish I could remember what I was thinking, and was probably debating whether to break up with my boyfriend. Maybe whether cereal would make me sick on top of drinks, or even just singing in my head. All I know is that it was about 4 blocks from campus. I had turned onto the darker side streets and was ready to be almost home. That's when I saw a guy about half a block away walking towards me. Tall, sort of solid looking, baseball cap, but something about him made me pretty sure he was even older than the grad students we'd sometimes joke around with. I wasn't really scared, any more than any other night. I just plastered a smile on my face and got ready to chirp out, "Hi there, what a great night, isn't it?" I only got out, "Hi." I was still smiling when he sort of paused. Thinking back, it all happened so fast, I don't have a good feel for the timing of the whole thing. I just know I said hello, he paused and sort of tilted his head and looked at me. I don't remember what he looked like other than the dark hair. He wasn't much in the way of ambient light, and the street lights were pretty far apart around that area. He nodded slowly. I remember slowing down, thinking he was going to say something to me, and would have to react nicely. I was irritated, but I must have kept a smile on my face because he said pretty quietly in an extremely gravelly voice, "You should go home now. You're a nice girl, and nice girls shouldn't be out." I'll never forget the way he said that, the tone in his voice, and the precision of his word choice. I made a note to tell Bridget, crap, I met another weirdo. I picked up the pace though, calling out, "Have a great night," as I rounded the bend and saw the entrance to campus ahead. I walked quicker than normal, not running but definitely upping my pace, and I crashed, slept hard and almost missed my alarm to make it to work the next day. I was no amateur, and totally set my work before I left for the night. I was doing my side work at the restaurant before things picked up, when I saw one of my co-workers stop and stare at the TV set that blared away in the bar. It was drowned out at night when people crowded around 6 p.m, but it was loud and clear and the news was on. Turns out the night before, the rapist had broken into a house and attacked another woman. I'll spare you the details, they're pretty awful. I just wish the lady hadn't been having trouble sleeping. She kept staring at the digital alarm clock, playing games with the number, she said. If she kept her eyes open and saw the number flick, she'd fall asleep. Stupid games like that. I mean, she knew exactly what time someone walked into her room. Turns out it was about 10 minutes later, and a street over from where I saw the guy and trusted my stupid trick to keep me safe. She didn't see his face, but she talked about how his voice sounded like someone who'd been screaming all night, all hoarse and guttural. I still shiver at my close escape, and I still smile at strangers and say hi, but I don't walk at night anymore. It might not be as scary as some of the paranormal stuff everyone's seen, but it turns out I probably saw the face of evil, and it was dark enough that I barely saw anything at all. They never caught the guy. I don't even remember how it ended, just that it seemed to trail off once the school year started again.
I worked at McDonald's for 2 years and worked night shift for a few weeks while they were figuring things out, finding a manager. The dude gets up to the window to pay for his food, and he has a Bud Light can in his cup holder. He pays for his food, and I go to hand him his change and he grabs my hand and won't let go. I stare at him and he just won't let go. While I'm trying to pull it back without being too rude because maybe he's just mentally disabled or something, but he tries to pull it to his mouth. And that's when I put my lower body against the inside wall for leverage and pull my arm all the way back in. The dude hasn't said a word. I had to make the lion cook hand him his food because there was no way I was dealing with someone as disgusting as that.
I'm a 20-year-old female, and I was on my way home from work 9 months ago, just cruising by, passing in the left lane like you're supposed to. There was this white Buick just chilling in the left lane, and I get a little close to his butt, cause he's going slow in the fast lane. And then this man starts brake checking me multiple times. Then a red light comes up, and he gets over to the right lane and rolls his window down. It was a nice day and I had mine down too. He's glaring at me and I'm like, "What? You ride in the right and pass in the left?" And he goes, "I was in the right, you stupid idiot." Apparently this middle-aged man didn't know his left from right, and after a second of arguing, the man pulls out into the middle of the intersection and makes a U-turn and is facing the grassy median and facing me with his camera pointed at me, still hollering. The lights turn green and I take off to get away from him. He turns around and follows. I go and get onto 2 different highways going about 90, safely avoiding people, and then I go back to the suburb, because now that he's following me I'm about to start leading him back to work because I wasn't going to lead him to my house. And my boyfriend was at work, so I knew I had people there to protect me. The light I wanted to turn right at was busy, so I cut through a gas station and turn right, barely stopping, still being cautious of the others around me, and this man still follows and my attempts to get away from him. At this point I'm fed up with him and want him to follow me back to work so I can kick his ass. I get back to the road we were on and got into the left lane, and the light was red. Instead of following me, he stays in the straight lane with his phone out at the window pointing at my car. At that point he stopped following me. Must have been too far out his way. But the 2 highways and turnarounds weren't. I hope he calls the cops, as my car is registered to a retired cop. And then on top of it, I know for a fact that the red light he ran at the beginning has light cameras. So I hope he got popped for that and has to pay the fine. I believe he did all of this because I drove a 2012 Ford Mustang, and people around here just don't like muscle car owners for some reason.
I worked as a nighttime guard in an old court, which shared a back wall with an equally old arrest building. The guard room where we spent time between patrols shared a wall with the execution chamber, which is no longer in use, but one that was active within my lifetime. So yeah, old, creaky building and room with such a morbid history combined create quite a mood. Now I generally don't believe in the supernatural, but the fear is there when you have to walk around a dark, empty building like that. One night I was patrolling as usual, looking around and was a good halfway into my typical patrol route, when I noticed something in a corner of my eye. Nothing obvious, just a small shape moving behind me. I've immediately turned around, but the thing ran to a nearby corridor, not making a sound and still staying out of my direct line of sight. So I'm there frozen. I stopped in a half turn, not moving a muscle and panicking. Seconds passed, and I'm weighing my options between doing my job and looking like an idiot calling someone. Finally, I move towards the corridor, trying to move silently. I look inside, shine my flashlight, and there's nothing there, which was almost worse than if there had been something there, since the corridors are interconnected, so whatever it was could have escaped to anywhere in the building. I look around and find nothing, and eventually decide to finish my patrol. I turn around, and it's on the other side. It's the same thing. I turn my head, and it scampers into the corridor I came from. Shocked, I moved my neck again, and weirdly, I see the same movement again. Turns out it was a stain in the corner of my glasses the entire time. I worked solo graveyard shift at the call center for a small security business. I see an alarm go off for the alley door. This has never happened, and I don't know how they got through the lock. I called the local security guard working and then police and watched the thief on cameras test all the doors while I waited for the guard. I was behind 3 more locked and coded doors, but it was scary hearing him go up and down the stairs to the alley through the wall. He left 5 minutes after, but it was terrifying. I wish he'd have been caught. I'm currently working night shift as a security guard at a factory, and one night I was chilling doing nothing like normal. And at 4 a.m, a bus which can only be described as a clown bus comes driving up to the guard shack through the thick-ass fog that was out that night, and I was convinced I was going to die. Turns out it was a blood drive, and the blood bus were just setting up early for their blood drive that was going to happen that day. But I swear, I'll never feel the same again about blood drives.
This happened about 6 months ago. Me and my brother were eating at a rest stop, taking breaks before we reached back to our university, almost 2 states away. While we're eating, this girl around the age of 10 to 12 suddenly greeted us in a sing-song fashion that made me perplexed. Her words were scripted, like for a child's commercial. Then she said she wanted to promote some products. I was stunned. How could there be an organization that is exploiting kids like this? First and foremost, she asked us to follow their Instagram, which just shows how they encourage young entrepreneurs, and it looked decent enough, definitely not shady. But this kid approached us with scripted words and unnecessary compliments as a way to make us buy their stuff. And the products are overpriced. A key strap, they said, was originally 20 Rand, but that they would sell it to us for 10. I know goddamn well I could probably buy the exact same one at half the price. She also offered us some masks because of the haze, but that's overpriced as well, and not the good kind you're supposed to be wearing. She then asked us where we were heading, and we kept it vague and said we're going back to college. She recognized the institute and said that she's from the same state as there, and I was almost fuming because we were 2 states away, almost 3 hours on the road, and there was this severely underaged minor promoting products at a rest stop after the sun has set. Where the hell are her parents? Eventually my brother caved and brought the strap, because we both couldn't figure out how to refuse politely this kid that would keep pushing us to buy their stuff. She wasn't the only one there, by the way. There were kids wearing the same t-shirts hovering all over the place, pestering people while they're eating. I know this really isn't that horrifying or disturbing, because it's just someone trying to sell you something, but think of the implication here. What kind of person sets their child up in an organization where they just badger people to buy things? I don't think that's right. I think that's definitely a recipe for disaster. This took place last July. My family rented this nice 1-story house in the outskirts of a sea town, and since it was on the side of a huge hill, we got a breathtaking sight of the sea. The house was a bit isolated from the other buildings of the residential area, since it was not directly on the street, but surrounded by trees. The master bedroom was quite small, with the king-sized bed at the center of a big closet in front of it. The window directly on the backyard. The backyard, where we hung our clothes to dry, had a ridiculously low and easy-to-climb fence, which went directly into the woods. When my brothers were there, we would climb out of the window and into the woods, just to feel like kids again. It was really hot, which I can't stand, so I always left every window open to let in a nice draft. I know I'm naive, but I did it only during the day in broad daylight and with other people home. My brothers and dad couldn't be there because they had to work during the weekdays, so it was just me and my mum, and my grandma stayed in a hotel in the center of the town. I was on my period for a whole week, and I didn't feel like going to the beach. So my mum, just because you're 18 and an adult now, agreed to leave me at home alone so that she could go with my grandma. Of course, I didn't want to stay home alone, so I called a close friend of mine, an almost boyfriend to be honest, who happened to be staying in the same town for the holidays, a guy called Ray. So he came over, brought some weed, and I was really excited to try it. We were sitting on the balcony enjoying our smoke and the view, chatting quietly when I heard a soft crashing sound, as if someone fell on one of the many carpets we had there. When I mentioned it, Ray laughed it off and said that I'm hearing things, and that's normal with drugs, but I was pretty sure of my hearing, which never fails, and is exceedingly good. "Maybe it's just your cat," Ray said. We both knew I couldn't bring my cat on vacation with me, and that it had to stay in my hometown, but we searched regardless, laughing like idiots. Ray opened the kitchen cupboard screaming, "I'ma find that before you." I went into the master bedroom, opened the closet, giggling like, "Here kitty kitty, stop hiding." Then I kneeled and looked under the bed. But what I found was not what I was expecting. There was a dude laying on the ground and staring at me, wide-eyed. I'm pretty sure time stopped as well as my heart. I have no idea what kept me from screaming at the top of my lungs, but I got up, padded out the room and shut the door behind me. My mind was trying to process what I'd just seen. I never let go of the handle. I think my knuckles turned white at some point. Ray paddled over, giggling, but he went dead serious as he looked at me. I told him there was a guy under my mum's bed. He thought I was hallucinating and tried to joke about it, but I grabbed my mum's phone and dialed my mum's number. Later on, he told me he had understood I was serious, only when he saw my hand shaking and my fingers having a hard time dialing. When my mum picked up, I sounded so cold and controlled that it gives me chills whenever I think about it. I told her I was with Ray and that we found an intruder. My mum arrived in 5 minutes, and not much after her, the cops did too. They didn't find anyone, of course. My mum noticed a pair of panties missing from their clothes hanging outside, but other than that, there were no other signs of intrusion. The cops had a hard time believing us because of the smell of weed. Of course, Mum gave me a huge scold about that, and we never heard about the case again. I'm sure I wasn't hallucinating because he was there, and I remember every single detail of his face and how he held his breath. Me and Ray joke about it sometimes, but I'm pretty sure he was creeped out too. Needless to say, I don't keep windows open anymore if there isn't screening. So weird dude hiding under my mum's bed? Let's never meet again. "7 months ago, I moved out of my parents' place and in to a house with my boyfriend. He had already lived there for about 2 years, but never experienced anything to make him think it was haunted. He's a skeptic, and as he says, nothing scares him. It's also important to note that this house is roughly 100 years old. No one's been born in it, and no one has died in it. Before I moved in, I did notice some spooky happenings. Doors opening and closing without any assistance, creaking floorboards in the bedroom and on the stairs. I myself am a skeptic, but only believe something is supernatural when I can't debunk it. I know old houses creak, have pipes that bang, and can tell the difference between these happening and others. This experience that I'm about to share with you happened after I moved in. I share a bed with my boyfriend and a small dog. Normally, I'm a light sleeper. I'm a lighter sleeper as they come. But this night I was so exhausted from work that I passed out and slept like a rock. But at 3 or 4 a.m. I woke up to my dog jumping on the bed and walking around a few times. This is quite normal for him. So I tried to get back to sleep. But in the back of my mind I noticed a noise, like a wet cough, but I ignored it. Then my boyfriend started shaking me gently awake. Do you hear that? He sounded panicked, so I picked myself up on the elbows and listened. But the sound was so out of place that it didn't even register in my half-asleep mind. Baby, can you hear that too? At this point, my dog is growling and fighting to get under the bed. He was reaching his paw under and stomping at something, mixed with his growl and the sound of a fussing baby. It sounded like he was about to start to wail, like a newborn would. It took about 10 long seconds of listening to the sound before I suddenly got really angry. Out of nowhere, I reached over, picked the dog up, put him back on the bed and lay back down, saying, "It's not important, ignore it." I only remember picking the dog up and mumbling that because I was so tired. But my boyfriend said I spoke clearly and sounded mad. I passed out again almost immediately. But both my dog and boyfriend stayed up for the rest of the night, listening for the sound that stopped once I fell back asleep. When I woke up, it was as if I blinked and sleep was over. There were no dreams at all. My boyfriend doesn't want to talk about it anymore because it freaked him out too much. We know for a fact that our neighbors don't have any children, and there was no TV on, no phone, no laptops, or anything to make that noise. And there's nothing under the bed. We checked in the morning. To this day, I can't explain what happened this night. It was roughly 11 p.m. I was winding down for the night, and I did my normal nightly routine, which included using the restroom and leaving a light on in the bathroom. I do this so that I can see better when going to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I climbed into my bed and prepared to go to sleep, but not even 3 minutes into laying down and closing my eyes, I hear the very clear voice of a woman whisper in my ear, "I'm here." At this point, I shot up out of bed, but before I could do anything else, I heard footsteps walking up to my door and stopping right outside of it. Now, this could have just been a random noise, but what was worse is that I could see the shadow of 2 feet standing just on the other side of my door due to the light coming from the bathroom. At this point, I could barely move from the seated position I was in on my bed. After about 5 minutes, I decided to turn on my TV so that I had some background noise. As the TV was powering on though, I started to hear the sound of someone's breathing coming from under my bed. And I knew it wasn't me, because I could hear it, even when I held my own breath. At this point, I was in absolute fear and could barely move from my bed, and I stayed that way for another 2 or so hours. I don't remember why exactly, but at some point I needed to get out of bed and grab something, but I still occasionally was hearing breathing from under the bed. I felt better getting up, knowing that I had a knife on my bedstand and could defend myself if needed. So I got out of bed and decided to look underneath. I grabbed a flashlight and my knife and looked. To my shock, there was nothing. This cleared up a bit of horror for me that I was feeling, but there were still feet on the other side of the door. So I built up the courage and opened the door, and yet again, there was nothing there. Even after clearing this up, I still didn't sleep that night. To this day, I can't fathom what happened. I don't know how to explain it, if there even is an explanation. If any of you have any idea what this could have been, please let me know.